All four of you, get in. Those 5 words would shatter everything Cole Merrick thought he knew about loyalty, legacy, and love. When a rancher's son defied his empire-building father to protect a desperate young woman and her 3 siblings, he ignited a battle that would test whether family is born from blood or forged in courage. This is the story of Montana Territory, 1882, where survival meant fighting, belonging meant sacrifice, and home was worth losing everything. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Montana Territory stretched endless and unforgiving in the dying light of October 1882, a landscape that promised freedom but delivered hardship in equal measure. The wind that swept across the high plains carried the bite of winter yet to come, rattling through the scattered pines and bending the wild grass that had turned gold with the season's change. In this vastness, human settlements appeared as small, defiant marks against nature's overwhelming canvas, fragile, temporary, always one disaster away from disappearing entirely. Eleanor Wade had learned this truth the hard way. She stood beside the sagging cabin that had become her entire world, 22 years old, but with eyes that had aged beyond their years. Her hands, raw and calloused from work that never ended, moved with mechanical efficiency as she hung laundry on a line stretched between 2 weathered posts. Each shirt, each pair of small trousers, told a story of survival. Mended patches on top of older patches, fabric worn thin but stubbornly clean. Pride was one of the few things she had left, and she clung to it with the same fierce determination that kept her upright when everything inside her wanted to collapse. The cabin behind her leaned slightly to the left, its logs chinked with mud that dried and cracked with each passing season. The roof, patched with whatever materials she could scavenge, leaked in 3 places when it rained. The single window, glass being a luxury they couldn't afford, was covered with oiled paper that let in light but kept the world at a hazy distance. It wasn't much. By any standard measure, it was barely shelter, but it was theirs, and that made it everything. Inside, 3 young voices created the familiar chaos of evening. Thomas, at 12, was trying to maintain order as he always did, the weight of being the oldest boy settling on his narrow shoulders in ways that broke Eleanor's heart. Margaret, 10 years old and fierce as a wildcat, was arguing about something. She was always arguing about something, that stubborn streak a mirror of Eleanor's own. And little Samuel, just 7, was probably underfoot as usual, his presence a constant reminder of how close they all were to the edge. Influenza had taken their parents 6 months ago, sweeping through the scattered homesteads like an invisible reaper. First their father, strong as an ox one day and burning with fever the next. Then their mother, who'd fought to stay alive for her children, but lost that battle in the gray morning light of a day Eleanor would never forget. The disease had passed over the children with barely a touch, as if death itself understood the cruelty of leaving them orphaned would be punishment enough. Their uncle, their father's older brother, had come after the funerals. He'd stayed 2 weeks, long enough to show Thomas how to set snares and check them, long enough to teach Eleanor which plants could supplement their meager stores through winter, long enough to leave behind his old rifle with stern instructions about using it. Then he'd ridden off to his own struggling homestead 3 territories away, promising to return in spring if he could. They all knew what "if he could" meant. Out here, promises were made in good faith, but kept only if fortune allowed. So Eleanor had become mother, father, teacher, and provider. She rose before dawn to tend the small garden that somehow, miraculously, had produced enough to see them through. She hunted rabbits when she could, though ammunition was precious and her aim still left much to be desired. She taught lessons by lamplight from the 3 books they owned, making sure her siblings could read and cipher, determined that poverty wouldn't steal their education along with everything else. She negotiated with the occasional traveling merchant, trading her sewing work for flour and salt and the other necessities that couldn't be grown or made. And she did it all while fighting the creeping fear that it wouldn't be enough. The land they lived on existed in a legal gray area that Eleanor didn't fully understand. Her father had claimed it, built the cabin, worked the soil, but the formal paperwork, the official filing that would make it legally theirs, had never been completed. He'd always meant to get around to it, but then survival took precedence over bureaucracy, and then he was gone. Eleanor had looked at the papers he'd left, tried to make sense of the legal language, but without money for a lawyer, or a clear understanding of the territorial claim office procedures, she'd done nothing. The land was theirs because they lived on it, worked it, needed it. In her mind, that should have been enough. She was about to learn how little should mattered in Montana territory. Eleanor had just pinned the last shirt to the line when she heard the horse. The sound carried clearly in the evening quiet, the steady rhythm of hooves, the creak of leather, the jingle of tack. A lone rider, approaching from the north. Her hand instinctively went to her side, remembering the rifle leaning just inside the cabin door. Visitors were rare, and rare things in this territory were usually either desperately needed or desperately unwanted. There wasn't much middle ground. She moved toward the cabin door, her eyes tracking the approaching figure. He rode well, she noticed, comfortable in the saddle in that way that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. He was tall, she could tell even at a distance, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years under the Montana sun. His clothes were practical, but of better quality than what most drifters wore. The horse beneath him was well fed, well cared for, the kind of animal that represented significant investment, not a drifter then, someone with means. That could be better or worse, depending. Eleanor's fingers found the rifle's worn stock just as the rider came close enough for her to see his face clearly. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two past, with the kind of features that suggested both strength and restraint. Sun-creased lines marked the corners of his eyes, and his jaw carried the shadow of stubble that said he'd been riding for a while. But it was his expression that made Eleanor hesitate. Calm, open, without the predatory assessment she'd learned to recognize in men who saw a young woman alone as opportunity rather than person. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin, far enough that he wasn't threatening the threshold, but close enough to speak without shouting. His hand stayed visible on the pommel of his saddle, making no move toward the rifle sheathed there or the pistol at his hip. Small gestures, but Eleanor had learned to read such things. Out here, manners could mean the difference between hospitality and gunfire. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the slow, measured cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt genuine rather than mocking. "Name's Cole Merrick. I ranch up north about 15 miles. Thought I'd ride down and meet the new neighbors, seeing as I haven't had the chance before now." Eleanor kept the rifle lowered but didn't set it aside. "We've been here over a year, Mr. Merrick. We're not exactly new." Something flickered across his face, acknowledgement of the point, maybe, or respect for the directness. "You're right, ma'am, and I apologize for that. Should have come sooner. Truth is, I've been—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "dealing with my own concerns. But that's no excuse for poor neighboring." The cabin door creaked open behind Eleanor, and she felt rather than saw Samuel slip through, pressing against her side with that mixture of fear and curiosity that defined childhood in uncertain times. His small hand found hers, gripping tight. "Is he here to make us leave?" Samuel whispered, his voice carrying in the quiet. Cole Merrick's expression shifted, something passing through his eyes that looked like genuine pain. He dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate and non-threatening, and took a few steps forward before dropping into a crouch so he was eye level with the boy. The gesture surprised Eleanor. Most men wouldn't diminish themselves that way, wouldn't meet a child on equal ground. "No, son," Cole said softly, his eyes steady on Samuel's frightened face. "I'm not here to make you leave. I'm here to make sure you stay." The words hung in the evening air like a promise, or maybe a challenge. Eleanor felt something crack in her chest, some defensive wall she'd built so carefully over the past 6 months. She'd grown so used to fighting, to expecting the worst, to seeing threats in every shadow. The simple kindness in this stranger's voice, the gentleness with which he addressed her terrified little brother, cut through her guard more effectively than any threat could have. "We don't need charity," she heard herself say, the words automatic, defensive. But even as she spoke them, she hated how they sounded, bitter, small, ungrateful. She didn't want to be that person. She didn't want this hardship to make her mean. Cole stood, his attention shifting back to her. "Didn't offer any, ma'am, just offered neighboring. There's a difference." He glanced at the cabin, at the laundry line, at the small garden plot visible in the fading light. "Looks like you're doing fine on your own, but doing fine alone doesn't mean you can't do better with friends. We don't know you." "No, ma'am, you don't, But that's easily fixed. He gestured to his horse. I've got some coffee in my saddlebags. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute. Would it be all right if I shared a cup with you? No obligation, no expectation, just neighbors getting acquainted. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. Accepting anything felt like opening a door she might not be able to close. But Samuel was still pressed against her side, and she could feel Thomas and Margaret peering through the cabin window, their curiosity barely contained. How long had it been since they'd had a visitor? Since someone had shown them simple human kindness without calculation behind it? All right, she said finally, lowering the rifle completely. But we sit outside. I don't invite strangers into my home. Cole's smile was slight but genuine. Fair enough. I wouldn't expect otherwise. He retrieved his saddlebags and a small pot from his horse, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made camp countless times. Eleanor set the rifle just inside the door, close enough to reach if needed, and settled onto the bench her father had built years ago. Samuel immediately climbed into her lap, still uncertain about this stranger, but unwilling to leave his sister's side. Thomas and Margaret eventually emerged from the cabin, curiosity overcoming caution, positioning themselves on either side of Eleanor like small guards. Cole noticed their formation, but didn't comment on it. He built a small fire in the stone ring near the cabin, a fire ring Eleanor herself had constructed, and set the coffee to brew with movements that spoke of long practice. As he worked, he talked, his voice easy and unhurried. My father owns the Merrick Ranch, he said, not looking at them directly, giving them the space to study him without scrutiny. Biggest spread in this part of the territory? Been here since '68, right after the territory was organized. Built it from nothing into something. He paused, something complicated crossing his face. Into something substantial. You don't sound happy about that, Margaret observed, with the blunt honesty that made her both Eleanor's pride and constant worry. Cole glanced at her, and Eleanor saw surprise in his eyes. Not at the statement, but at the perception behind it. You're a sharp one, aren't you? Margaret, Eleanor warned softly, but Cole waved off her concern. No, she's right to speak her mind. Out here, honesty's worth more than politeness. He poured coffee into tin cups, the aroma rich and wonderful, a luxury Eleanor hadn't experienced in months. My father built an empire. I respect what that took. But building an empire means making choices, and not all of those choices sit easy with me. He handed cups to Eleanor and Thomas, then produced a small paper-wrapped package from his coat. Peppermint sticks, he said, offering them to Margaret and Samuel. If your sister says it's all right. Eleanor wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain that wall of proud independence, but she saw the longing in her siblings' faces, the way Samuel's eyes had gone wide with desire. What kind of sister would she be to deny them such a small joy? Thank you, she said quietly. That's thoughtful. My mother used to give them to me when I was small, Cole said, watching Samuel and Margaret carefully unwrap their treasures. Before she passed. Some memories are worth keeping. There was something in the way he said it, a shared understanding of loss, that created a thread of connection between them. Eleanor found herself studying him more carefully, seeing past her initial wariness to the man beneath. There was sorrow in him, she realized, but also strength, and something else, a kind of restlessness, as if he were looking for something he hadn't yet found. They talked as the sun set completely and the stars emerged in their thousands. Cole asked about their family, and Eleanor found herself telling him more than she'd intended, about her parents, about the illness, about her uncle who'd tried to help but had his own struggles, about the cabin that needed repairs she didn't know how to make, about the coming winter that terrified her more than she wanted to admit. In return, Cole spoke of his father's ranch, of the hundreds of cattle and dozens of men who worked there. He talked about his mother, dead 3 years now, and how her absence had changed something fundamental in his father. He spoke of expectations and duty, of a legacy that felt more like a burden than a gift. Why do you stay? Eleanor asked, the coffee and the darkness making her bold. If you're not happy there, why not leave? Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire. Because leaving feels like betrayal. Because it's all I've ever known. Because He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I keep thinking maybe I can make it better. Maybe I can be the kind of rancher my father was before grief made him hard. Maybe I can build something worth having instead of just accumulating. Eleanor understood that distinction more than he could know. She looked around at their humble homestead, the sagging cabin, the small garden, the patch of land that barely sustained them. By any objective measure, they had almost nothing. But it was theirs, earned through sweat and stubbornness and love. That meant something her wealthy neighbor seemed to understand, even if he couldn't quite articulate it. "You've built something here," Cole said, as if reading her thoughts. "Against odds that would have broken most people. That's worth more than land or cattle or any empire." The words settled into Eleanor's chest, finding a home there. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded, letting the silence speak for her. Samuel had fallen asleep against her, his small body heavy with the trust of exhaustion. Margaret was yawning, fighting to stay awake but losing the battle. Even Thomas, who'd been watching Cole with the careful assessment of someone who'd been forced to become a man too soon, was showing signs of fatigue. Cole stood, reading the moment correctly. "I should head back. It's a fair ride in the dark." He moved to his horse, then paused, turning back. "Ma'am, Miss Wade, would you object if I came back? Maybe helped with some of those repairs?" Pride warred with practicality in Eleanor's chest. Pride wanted to refuse, to maintain that independence that was costing them so dearly. But practicality saw the coming winter, saw the roof that leaked, and the door that didn't close properly, and the 100 small failures that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. "I can't pay you," she said finally. "Didn't ask you to. Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it works out here. Or how it should work." "Why?" The question came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "Why do you care? You don't know us. We're nothing to you." Cole's expression grew serious, thoughtful. "My mother used to say that character shows itself in how we treat people who can't offer us anything in return. I didn't understand what she meant when I was young. I understand it now." He swung up into his saddle with easy grace. "Besides, I've spent too much time around people who measure everything by profit and loss. It's refreshing to see someone building something purely because they need a home." He touched his hat brim again, that same gesture of respect. "Good night, Miss Wade. Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, pleasure meeting you all." He rode off into the darkness, the sound of his horse fading gradually until it was lost in the vast Montana night. Eleanor sat on the bench holding her sleeping brother, with Thomas and Margaret drowsing on either side. Above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and hopes. "Do you trust him?" Thomas asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet, but I think maybe I want to." It was the most honest answer she could give. In the morning, she would return to the exhausting routine of survival. She would worry about winter and money and 1,000 things she couldn't control. But tonight, for just a moment, the burden felt slightly lighter. Someone had noticed them. Someone had cared enough to ride 15 miles just to introduce himself. Someone had looked at their struggling homestead and seen worth instead of failure. That had to mean something. In a land as harsh as Montana Territory, kindness was rare enough to be treasured, questioned, and cautiously accepted all at once. The next morning arrived with frost painting delicate patterns on the cabin's single window. Eleanor woke, as always, before dawn, her body trained to maximize the limited daylight hours. She carefully extracted herself from the tangle of sleeping siblings. All 4 of them had ended up in the single large bed they shared for warmth, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. The fire in the small stove had died to embers overnight. She coaxed it back to life with practiced efficiency, adding precious kindling and waiting for the flames to catch before adding larger pieces. Every stick of wood represented labor, chopping, hauling, stacking. Nothing came easy, and nothing could be wasted. As the cabin slowly warmed, Eleanor went about the morning routine. Gruel from their dwindling oat supply for breakfast, water hauled from the creek a quarter-mile away, the route worn smooth by her daily trips. Checking their food stores and doing mental calculations she'd done so many times they'd become almost automatic. If the weather held and the hunting was decent and they were very, very careful, they might make it to spring. Might. She was scrubbing the breakfast pot when she heard the wagon. The sound was distinctive, different from a single rider, heavier and more deliberate. Eleanor's first instinct was the familiar clench of anxiety. But when she looked through the oiled paper window, she saw Cole Merrick driving a loaded wagon toward the cabin, his horse tied to the back. He'd come back. He'd actually come back. Thomas appeared at her elbow, alert despite the early hour. "Should I get the rifle?" "No," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not yet." She stepped outside as Cole pulled the wagon to a stop. In the morning light, she could see the load more clearly: lumber, shingles, bags of what looked like grain or flour, tools, supplies that would have taken her months to acquire even if she'd had the money, which she didn't. "Good morning, Miss Wade," Cole called, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked like he'd been up even earlier than she had, already worked and ready for more. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to get an early start on those repairs." Eleanor walked toward the wagon, her emotions a complicated tangle. "Mr. Merrick, I told you I couldn't pay for—" "And I told you I wasn't asking for payment," he interrupted gently. "These are materials I had sitting unused at the ranch. Might as well put them to good use." He gestured to the cabin. "That roof isn't going to survive another hard winter. I know that, you know that. No point in either of us pretending otherwise." He was right, and Eleanor hated that he was right. The roof had been a constant source of worry, a problem too big for her to solve alone, but impossible to ignore. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Cole climbed down from the wagon, moving with that same deliberate courtesy he'd shown the night before. "Honestly, neither do I, exactly. But when I rode back to the ranch last night, I kept thinking about—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "About what my mother would have expected from me. About the kind of man I want to be versus the kind I'm surrounded by. You and your siblings, you're trying to build something real. I want to help. Maybe that's enough reason." Thomas and Margaret had emerged from the cabin, their eyes wide at the loaded wagon. Samuel pressed against Eleanor's leg, his small hand finding hers. All of them were too thin, she realized suddenly, seeing them through a stranger's eyes, too worn for their ages, too marked by the hardship that had become their normal. "All right," Eleanor heard herself say, "but I'll work alongside you, and when I can pay you back, when I have something to trade or sell, I will." "Fair enough." Cole's smile was quick and genuine. "Though I warn you, I'm going to argue about that later. For now, though, I could use an extra pair of hands. Thomas, you know how to hold a ladder steady?" The boy straightened, pride and responsibility warring on his young face. "Yes, sir." "Good man. Let's get to work then." The day that followed was unlike any Eleanor had experienced since her parents died. Cole worked with a competence born of experience, assessing the cabin's needs and addressing them with steady efficiency. But he also taught as he worked, showing Thomas how to measure and cut, explaining to Margaret why certain repairs mattered more than others, even letting Samuel help by handing up tools or nails. He treated them not as charity cases, but as equal participants in a shared project. When Eleanor pointed out a weak spot in the wall he'd missed, he accepted the correction without male pride getting in the way. When Thomas made a mistake measuring, Cole showed him how to fix it without making the boy feel foolish. He worked steadily, but not frantically, taking breaks to drink water and rest, showing by example that good work didn't require driving yourself to exhaustion. By mid-afternoon, the roof had new shingles over the worst sections. The door had been rehung properly and actually closed. The gaps in the wall had been chinked with proper mortar instead of mud. The cabin, while still humble, looked cared for in a way it hadn't since their father died. "You're good at this," Eleanor observed, handing Cole a cup of water as he climbed down from the roof. "My mother insisted I learn every job on the ranch," he said, accepting the cup gratefully. "She said a man who couldn't do a task himself had no business asking others to do it. My father thought it was foolishness. That's what hired men were for, but she insisted." His expression softened with memory. "I'm glad she did. Some of the best conversations I ever had were working alongside the ranch hands, learning from them." Eleanor found herself curious about this woman she'd never meet, this mother who'd clearly shaped her son in fundamental ways. What was she like? Cole was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Fierce, kind, stubborn as hell when she believed in something. She saw people, if that makes sense, not just their utility or what they could do for her, but who they actually were. He looked at Eleanor directly. I think she would have liked you. The way you're fighting for your family, the way you're building something from almost nothing. That would have impressed her. The compliment settled warm in Eleanor's chest, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. Thank you, she said quietly. They worked until the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Cole packed his tools with the same methodical care he'd shown all day, refusing Eleanor's offer of supper but accepting a promise that he could return to finish the remaining repairs. There's still work to do on that back wall, he said, surveying the cabin with a critical eye. And your winter wood supply is looking sparse. I'll bring some loads over in the next few days if that's all right. Mr. Merrick, you've already… Cole, he interrupted gently. If we're going to be neighbors, seems like we should use first names. And before you argue about accepting more help, consider that refusing could mean real hardship for your siblings when winter comes full force. Pride's admirable, Miss Wade, but it's a cold comfort when the temperature drops. He was right, and Eleanor knew it. The wood supply that had seemed almost adequate was really barely sufficient, and she didn't have the tools or strength to harvest more before the serious cold arrived. Accepting help felt like surrender, but condemning her siblings to genuine suffering out of stubborn pride would be worse. Eleanor, she said finally. My name is Eleanor. Cole's smile was warm, transforming his sun-weathered face. Eleanor, he repeated, as if testing the name. That suits you. Strong. Old-fashioned in the best way. After he'd ridden off, Thomas helped Eleanor finish the evening chores while Margaret and Samuel played a game with sticks and stones in the dooryard. The cabin felt different now, sturdier, more secure. The repairs were practical, but they represented something more. The possibility that they weren't as alone as Eleanor had believed, that the world might contain people who helped without expecting immediate return, that survival might not have to be quite so lonely. That night, as she settled her siblings into bed, Margaret asked the question Eleanor had been pondering herself. Why is Mr. Cole helping us? I don't know, honey. Maybe because he can. Maybe because it's the right thing to do. Papa used to say most people only do things if they get something back, Thomas observed, his 12-year-old cynicism born of hard experience. Papa also said there were still good people in the world, Eleanor countered softly. Maybe Mr. Cole is one of them. Or maybe he wants something we don't know about yet, Thomas said, his voice heavy with the suspicion that poverty and loss had taught them all. Eleanor couldn't argue with that possibility. She'd thought the same thing herself, that wariness never quite leaving despite Cole's apparent sincerity. Maybe. We'll be careful. But we'll also accept the help we need. That's the balance we have to find. In her own bed later, Eleanor lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of her sleeping siblings. The cabin was warmer tonight, the repaired walls keeping out the wind that usually snaked through gaps. The roof above her head was solid, no longer threatening to fail with the next strong storm. Small changes, practical changes, but they altered the landscape of her worry in meaningful ways. She thought about Cole Merrick, about the contradiction he presented. A wealthy rancher's son who worked with his hands and treated poor homesteaders with respect. A man who spoke of duty and legacy, but seemed to be searching for something beyond what his birthright offered. A person who'd appeared in their lives exactly when they needed help most, which could be either providence or the setup for some scheme Eleanor couldn't yet see. The smart thing would be to maintain distance, accept only minimal help, keep her guard high. The necessary thing might be to trust carefully, to let this unexpected assistance give them the edge they needed to survive. The line between smart and necessary had never been less clear. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, its voice carrying across the vast Montana night. The sound should have been lonely, should have emphasized their isolation. Instead, tonight, it felt like part of a larger conversation. Wild voices calling, being heard, finding their place in the darkness. Maybe she and her siblings could do the same. Maybe they could be heard, could find their place, could survive not just through stubborn isolation, but through the careful, risky business of letting someone help. Cole returned 2 days later with a wagon load of cut wood, stacked and seasoned and ready for burning. He returned again 3 days after that to finish the wall repairs and shore up the small barn that housed their single cow. He came the following week to help Thomas set new snares and to teach him the best locations for them. Each visit brought practical help, but also conversation, laughter, the slow building of trust. Eleanor found herself watching for his arrival, though she tried not to admit it even to herself. She noticed things about him, the way he always brought small treats for the younger children but never made a show of it, the way he listened when Margaret launched into one of her passionate speeches about fairness or justice, the way he treated Thomas as a young man rather than a boy, giving him responsibility and respect in equal measure. And she noticed the way Cole looked at their homestead, with something in his eyes that looked almost like envy. Here was a man who had everything by material measure, and yet he seemed to find value in their poverty in ways that puzzled and intrigued her. "What do you see when you look at this place?" she asked him one afternoon, as they sat on the bench watching Thomas demonstrate his improved snare-setting technique for Samuel. Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Purpose," he said finally. "Everything here exists because it needs to. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. You're building a home, not an empire. There's something pure about that." "But pure and poverty-stricken," Eleanor said dryly. "Maybe, but I've spent my whole life around wealth, and I can tell you, money doesn't make something a home. It just makes it expensive." He turned to look at her directly. "You've made something real here. That matters." The intensity in his voice surprised her, the depth of feeling behind words that might have sounded simple or patronizing from someone else. She found herself seeing him differently, not as the wealthy neighbor condescending to help, but as someone genuinely searching for meaning in a life that apparently hadn't provided it despite every material advantage. "Your father's ranch," she said carefully. "It's not home to you?" Cole's laugh was short, without humor. "It's a place I live. It's land I'll inherit. But home? No. It stopped being that when my mother died. Now it's just an operation, a business, an empire being built with more concern for expansion than for the people doing the building." There was bitterness in his voice, and something else, a deep sadness that spoke of disappointments Eleanor could only imagine. She thought about her own father, poor but loving, building this cabin with his own hands as a gift for his family. The structure might be humble, but it had been built with joy. She wondered if Cole's grand ranch house had ever known that kind of love. "You could leave," she said, echoing his own question from weeks ago. "Build something of your own." "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but that would mean abandoning the ranch hands who depend on my father's empire for their living. It would mean letting that empire become even more ruthless without anyone to argue for basic human decency. I keep thinking I can make it better from within." "Can you?" "I don't know. I keep trying. Keep failing, mostly. My father and I—" He paused, something pained crossing his face. "We see the world differently. He sees resources and opportunities. I see people. It makes for a lot of arguments." Margaret called out something from near the barn, her voice bright with laughter, and Samuel's answering giggle carried clearly in the cold air. Cole smiled at the sound, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "They're good kids," he said. "You've done remarkable work with them, keeping them together, keeping them educated and hopeful. That's no small thing." "They're all I have," Eleanor said simply. "Failure isn't an option. And yet most people in your situation would have failed anyway, would have given up, sent the children to orphanages or workhouses, tried to save themselves. You didn't. That takes a special kind of courage." Eleanor didn't feel particularly courageous. She felt tired, worried, stretched too thin across too many responsibilities. But she also felt the warm satisfaction of having made it this far, of having kept her family together through the worst of times. If that was courage, she'd take it. As autumn deepened toward winter, Cole's visits became part of the rhythm of their lives. He brought supplies they needed: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, always claiming he'd over-ordered for the ranch and it would just go to waste otherwise. He brought news from the wider world, stories about territorial politics in distant places that reminded them they weren't completely cut off from civilization. He brought skills and knowledge, teaching them 100 small things that made their survival slightly more secure. But more than anything, he brought his presence. His steady, calm, competent presence that somehow made their small cabin feel less isolated, made their struggle feel less desperate. Having him there, working alongside them, laughing at Margaret's jokes, listening to Thomas's tentative observations about the world, swinging Samuel up onto his shoulders, it reminded Eleanor of what family could feel like when the weight of responsibility was shared. She tried not to lean on that feeling too much, tried to remember that Cole had his own life, his own responsibilities, his own future that probably didn't include a struggling homestead and a woman with 3 siblings to raise. But the heart was stubborn about these things, finding hope in places reason said it shouldn't look. One evening in late November, with the first serious snow beginning to fall, Cole stayed later than usual, helping them prepare the cabin and barn for the storm everyone could feel coming. They worked by lamplight, making sure every gap was sealed, every animal secured, every window covered. When the work was done, Eleanor made coffee, real coffee, from the supply Cole had brought, and they sat in the warm cabin while the wind picked up outside. Samuel had fallen asleep in Cole's lap, that casual trust that children showed when they felt safe. Cole held the boy carefully, his large hands gentle, his expression soft as he looked down at the sleeping child. "He trusts you," Eleanor observed quietly. "I'm glad. I'd never want to break that." Cole's voice was equally quiet, as if afraid to wake the boy. "Trust is rare out here. Precious." "Is that what this is?" Eleanor asked, voicing the question that had been building in her for weeks. "Trust?" Cole looked at her over Samuel's head, his eyes serious in the lamplight. "I hope so. I'd like it to be friendship, if you're willing. I'd like to think we're building something here that goes beyond neighboring, something more lasting." The words hung between them, weighted with meanings Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to examine. But she couldn't deny the truth in them either. Something was building here, trust, yes, but also affection, connection, the slow recognition of kindred spirits finding each other in an unlikely place. "I'd like that too," she said softly, and meant it with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the Montana landscape in white. Inside the small, warm cabin, 6 people who'd been strangers just weeks ago sat together in comfortable silence, the foundation of something unexpected and potentially wonderful settling into place like snowflakes building toward a drift. Individually fragile, but collectively strong enough to change the landscape entirely. Winter arrived in earnest the day after that snowfall, transforming the Montana territory into a landscape of white silence and bitter cold. The transformation was both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful in the way the sun caught ice crystals and turned the world diamond bright. Terrifying in the way it isolated them completely, cut them off from the wider world, made survival depend entirely on preparation and luck in equal measure. Eleanor had faced one winter alone with her siblings. The memory of those dark, hungry months still woke her sometimes in the night, heart pounding with remembered fear. They'd made it through, but barely, subsisting on minimal rations and hoping desperately that the cold wouldn't break something vital before spring arrived. This winter felt different, and the difference was entirely due to the man who rode through snow and cold every few days to check on them. Cole came more frequently as the weather worsened, never empty-handed. Sometimes he brought supplies, lamp oil that extended their light into the long evenings, extra blankets that made the nights bearable, food that supplemented their stores in ways that meant the difference between mere survival and actual sustenance. Other times he brought labor, chopping wood until their supply grew from adequate to abundant, checking the barn and cabin for any weakness the cold might exploit, teaching Thomas the 100 small skills that separated those who thrived from those who merely endured. But more than supplies or labor, he brought something Eleanor hadn't realized they'd been starving for: companionship, adult conversation, the reminder that the world beyond their small cabin still existed and still contained kindness. "You're spending a lot of time away from your ranch," Eleanor observed one afternoon in mid-December. Cole had arrived that morning with a load of hay for their cow and had stayed to help Margaret with her arithmetic lessons, his patience with the girl's stubborn struggles somehow greater than Eleanor's own. Cole looked up from the slate where he'd been demonstrating long division, his expression carefully neutral. "The ranch runs fine without me constantly overseeing. My father's got it organized like a military operation. Sometimes I think he'd prefer if I just stayed out of the way entirely. There was something in his voice, a bitterness that had been growing more pronounced with each visit. Eleanor had learned to read the signs. The tension in his shoulders when he talked about home, the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned his father, the relief that seemed to settle over him the moment he arrived at their cabin, as if he were shedding a burden just by being there. "Does he know you're spending so much time here?" she asked, keeping her tone carefully casual even as something worried took root in her chest. "He knows I check on the neighbors. He doesn't know—" Cole paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He doesn't know how much it's come to mean to me, how much you all have come to matter." The words hung in the warm cabin air, weighted with meaning that made Eleanor's breath catch. Margaret had gone still, her eyes moving between Cole and her sister with the too perceptive gaze of a child who understood more than adults wanted to credit. Even Thomas, pretending to read by the window, had gone quiet in that way that meant he was listening intently. "Cole," Eleanor said softly, aware of all the ears in the small space, "we're grateful for your help. More grateful than I can properly express. But I need to understand what this is, what you're expecting. Because if there are obligations I'm incurring that I don't understand, I need to know now, before—" "No," Cole interrupted, his voice firm but not angry. "No obligations. No expectations beyond friendship. I'm not keeping a ledger, Eleanor. I'm not building up some debt you'll have to repay." He stood, moving to the window, his back to the room. "I'm here because being here makes me feel like I'm doing something that matters. Because your family reminds me what family is supposed to be. People who care about each other more than they care about property or position or legacy. Is that selfish? Maybe. But I'm not expecting anything from you beyond the chance to keep coming back." The honesty in his voice was almost painful. Eleanor found herself crossing the small space to stand beside him, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had become both prison and protection. "My father wants me to marry," Cole said quietly, his breath fogging the cold glass. "Barrett Merrick III, that's what he calls me, like I'm a continuation of him instead of my own person. He's got his eye on several suitable prospects, ranchers' daughters, women from good families, alliances that would expand our holdings or secure water rights or whatever strategic advantage he's currently pursuing. He talks about it like breeding cattle. Compatible bloodlines, good genetic stock, advantageous mergers." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. "And what do you want?" Cole turned to look at her, his eyes intense in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I want what your parents had, what I remember my parents having before my mother died. I want partnership, conversation, someone who sees me as Cole instead of as Barrett Merrick's heir. I want to build a home instead of an empire. I want—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself, awareness of the children in the room, perhaps reminding him to guard his words. "You want something real," Eleanor finished softly. "Yes, something real. Something that matters beyond property lines and profit margins." He glanced at Margaret and Thomas, both now openly watching their conversation. "Something like what you've built here. Not the poverty, I'm not romanticizing your struggles, but the purpose behind it. The love that makes it home instead of just shelter." Margaret, never one to stay quiet when her curiosity was engaged, spoke up. "Are you going to marry one of those suitable prospects?" "Margaret!" Eleanor's voice was sharp with embarrassment, but Cole just smiled slightly. "Fair question. Honest answer? Not if I can help it. My father can command a lot of things, but he can't command that. Not if I refuse." He looked back at Eleanor. "Though I suspect that refusal is going to cause problems sooner rather than later. My father isn't a man who accepts defiance gracefully." The words carried a warning Eleanor couldn't quite interpret, a shadow of something approaching that she couldn't yet see clearly. Before she could ask what he meant, Samuel burst through the door in a flurry of snow and excitement, his cheeks red with cold and his eyes bright with discovery. "Eleanor, Cole, I found tracks. Big tracks like you showed me." The boy was practically vibrating with the thrill of his observation, the hunter's pride of noticing what mattered. Cole's demeanor shifted immediately, the heavy conversation set aside as he focused on Samuel's enthusiasm. "Did you?" Show me what you found then. Let's see if we can tell what made them. He bundled into his coat and followed Samuel out into the cold, leaving Eleanor standing at the window with her thoughts in turmoil. Margaret appeared at her elbow, slipping her small hand into Eleanor's larger one. "He loves you," Margaret said matter-of-factly, with the blunt certainty of 10-year-old observation. "Margaret, that's not... He's our friend. He's helping us. He looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama, like you're the most important thing in the whole world, like everything makes sense when you're there." Margaret squeezed her sister's hand. "Don't you love him back?" Eleanor's first instinct was to deny it, to protect herself and her siblings from hoping for something so unlikely, so impossible. But standing there in the cabin Cole had helped make warm and secure, watching through the window as he crouched in the snow beside Samuel, patiently examining tracks and teaching as he always taught, with respect and genuine interest, she couldn't quite form the lie. "It doesn't matter what I feel," she said instead. "He's a rancher's heir. We're homesteaders who barely own the land we're standing on. His father wants him to marry someone suitable, someone who brings advantage to the family empire. That's not me, Margaret. That's never going to be me." "Why not?" The question was posed with a child's refusal to accept arbitrary limitations. "If he loves you and you love him, why does the rest matter?" "Because the world doesn't work that way, honey. Because love isn't always enough when there are so many other forces at play." Eleanor pulled her sister close, resting her chin on the girl's head. "Because sometimes caring about someone means understanding that you can't give them what they need, even if you wish you could." But even as she spoke the words, she felt their inadequacy. Cole didn't seem to want what his father's world could offer. He wanted something else, something that looked remarkably like what she and her siblings had built in this humble cabin. The question wasn't whether they could give each other what they needed. The question was whether the world would allow it. Outside, Cole lifted Samuel onto his shoulders, pointing at something in the distance, his patient explanation carrying faintly through the window glass. The sight made Eleanor's chest ache with a longing she'd been trying desperately to suppress. This could be her life. This man, these children, this sense of family knitting together from separate threads. It could be real, if the world were kinder, if circumstances were different, if want and need and love were enough to overcome the practical realities of class and expectation and duty. But the world was what it was, and wanting didn't change it. Cole and Samuel returned in a burst of cold air and laughter, the boy chattering excitedly about the deer tracks they'd found and the possibility of hunting them when he got older. Cole's eyes met Eleanor's over Samuel's head, something passing between them. Acknowledgement of the conversation they'd been having, perhaps, or recognition of the careful dance they were performing around feelings neither quite dared to name directly. He stayed for supper that night, as he'd begun doing more frequently. They ate simple food made abundant by his contributions, and afterward he helped Eleanor clean up while the children played a game Thomas had invented involving sticks and a ball made of wrapped fabric. The domestic normalcy of it all was both comforting and painful, this glimpse of what life could be, constantly shadowed by the knowledge of its impermanence. "My father's planning a gathering," Cole said quietly as they worked, his voice pitched low enough that the children wouldn't easily hear. "Right after Christmas. All the major ranchers and landowners in the territory. He does it every year, part business, part social display, part territorial pissing contest, if you'll excuse the language." "Why are you telling me this?" Cole's hand stilled in the wash water. "Because I'm expected to attend. Because it'll mean I can't visit for at least a week, maybe 2, depending on how long guests stay. Because..." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight of worry. "Because I think my father's planning something. He's been asking questions about the homesteaders in this area, about land claims and water rights. He's got that look he gets when he's identified an opportunity and is planning how to exploit it." Something cold slithered down Eleanor's spine. "Our land? I don't know. Maybe. He's mentioned this corridor several times. Says it's the natural expansion path for the ranch, that the creek that runs through your property would be valuable for watering cattle on the summer range." Cole turned to face her fully, his expression troubled. "Eleanor, your claim, is it filed? Is it legal and complete?" The question she'd been avoiding for months, the worry she'd pushed aside because addressing it required resources she didn't have. My father started the process, but he died before completing it. I have papers, but I don't know if they're enough. I don't know how to finish what he started, and I don't have money for a lawyer to help me figure it out. Cole's jaw tightened, anger flickering across his features. That's exactly the kind of vulnerability my father looks for. Unclear claims, incomplete paperwork, people who don't have the resources to fight legal battles. He's done it before. Found ways to acquire land from people who technically owned it, but couldn't prove it adequately under territorial law. Are you saying he'd try to take our home? Eleanor's voice came out stronger than she felt, anger burning through the fear. We've built this place. We've lived here, worked this land. That has to mean something. In a fair world, it would mean everything. In the Montana Territory legal system? Cole shook his head grimly. It means whatever the territorial judge says it means, and judges can be influenced by men with enough money and power. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's what happens. Eleanor's mind raced, calculating options and finding them all lacking. She could try to file the claim properly, but that required traveling to the territorial office, paying fees she couldn't afford, navigating legal requirements she didn't understand. She could hire a lawyer, but again, money she didn't have. She could hope her father's incomplete paperwork would be enough, but hoping had never been much of a strategy. What do I do? The question came out quieter than she'd intended. Vulnerability she hated showing, making her voice small. Cole reached for her hand, his grip warm and solid. We fight. We make sure your claim is ironclad before my father can challenge it. I'll pay for the lawyer. He held up a hand when she started to protest. And before you argue about charity or independence, consider this. If my father takes your land, where does that leave you? Where does that leave Thomas and Margaret and Samuel? Pride is admirable, Eleanor, but sometimes survival requires accepting help from people who care about you. People who care about me, Eleanor repeated, testing the words. Is that what this is? Yes, Cole said simply. No hesitation, no qualification. That's exactly what this is. I care about you, about all of you, more than is probably wise given the complications it creates. But I'm not going to apologize for it, and I'm not going to stand by and watch my father destroy what you've built just because he sees land as commodity instead of home. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression serious in that way that meant he'd been listening despite pretending not to. Is Mr. Cole's father going to try to take our home? Eleanor and Cole exchanged glances, the unspoken question of how much to share with children who'd already dealt with too much hardship. But Thomas was 12, old enough to understand threats, old enough to deserve honesty. He might try, Cole said, addressing the boy directly, man to almost man. But trying and succeeding are different things. We're going to make sure your claim to this land is legal and complete. We're going to make sure no one can take this from you. We, Thomas repeated, and Eleanor heard the question in it. Why are you fighting your own father for us? Cole was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words were measured, thoughtful. Because he's wrong. Because power and money don't give someone the right to take from those who have less. Because... He glanced at Eleanor, something vulnerable in his eyes. Because your family matters to me. Because this place matters. Because sometimes you have to choose what's right over what's easy. Thomas studied him with eyes too old for his years, then nodded slowly. Papa used to say that character is what you do when it costs you something, that anyone can be good when it's convenient. Your father was a wise man, Cole said quietly. I wish I could have known him. Later, after Cole had ridden off into the winter darkness, after the children were settled in bed, Eleanor sat alone by the dying fire and tried to make sense of the tangle her life had become. She'd been so focused on daily survival that she hadn't properly considered the larger threats, the ways their vulnerability extended beyond hunger and cold into legal territories she didn't understand. And now those threats were manifesting, brought by the very family whose son had become so important to them. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who was helping them survive was also the son of the man who might destroy them. The person she was coming to care for, to love, if she was honest with herself, was bound by blood and duty to an empire that saw her family as nothing more than an obstacle to expansion. Margaret appeared from the bedroom, padding quietly across the floor to curl up beside Eleanor on the bench. Can't sleep? Too much thinking, Eleanor admitted, wrapping an arm around her sister. About Mr. Cole? About everything, but yes, about Cole too. Eleanor sighed, pulling Margaret closer. It's complicated, honey. Love always is, isn't it? That's what Mama used to say. Margaret's voice was soft with memory. She said the complications are how you know it's real, that easy love isn't worth much. When did you get so wise? I pay attention. And I remember things. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then, Eleanor, are we really going to lose our home? The fear in her sister's voice broke Eleanor's heart. These children had lost so much already. Parents, stability, the innocent security of childhood. The thought of them losing this place too, of having to start over somewhere else or worse, being separated if Eleanor couldn't provide for them. It was unbearable. No, Eleanor said firmly, making the promise even though she couldn't be certain she could keep it. We're not going to lose this. Cole's going to help us make sure the claim is proper. We're going to fight for what's ours. Even if it means fighting Mr. Cole's father? Even if it makes trouble for him? Eleanor considered the question, thinking about Cole's face when he'd talked about his father, about the gathering that would keep him away, about the battle lines that seemed to be forming whether any of them wanted them or not. Even then, because he's right. What's right is more important than what's easy. And we have to believe that matters, Margaret. We have to believe that standing up for what's ours, for what's just, will make a difference. Do you think it will? I have to, Eleanor said simply. Because the alternative is giving up, and I don't know how to do that. Not when I'm responsible for you and Thomas and Samuel. Not when we've fought so hard to keep this family together. Margaret nodded against her shoulder, small body relaxing slightly. They sat together in the firelight, two sisters in a cabin that might or might not remain theirs, holding on to each other and onto hope in equal measure. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended tension. Cole came when he could, but his visits were shorter, interrupted by obligations at his father's ranch. The gathering Barrett Merrick was planning seemed to consume more time and attention than Cole had anticipated, pulling him into responsibilities he couldn't easily shed. When he did manage to visit, he brought updates that were rarely encouraging. My father's been talking to the Territorial Land Commissioner, he reported one afternoon, his face grim. Asking questions about claim procedures, about what constitutes valid ownership. He's being subtle about it, but I know how he operates. He's building a case. Against us specifically, or just gathering general information? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. I think against homesteaders in general, but your property specifically is on his mind. I heard him talking with his foreman about this creek corridor, about how it's the natural route for expanding summer grazing. Your land sits right in the middle of what he wants. Cole's frustration was evident in every line of his body. I've tried to argue against it, tried to convince him to leave well enough alone, but he sees it as business, pure calculation, no consideration for the people involved. Eleanor found herself thinking about Barrett Merrick, this man she'd never met, but who held such power over their fate. What kind of person saw a family struggling to survive and thought only of opportunity? What kind of father raised a son as decent as Cole while apparently embodying none of those same values? Tell me about your father, she said, the question emerging from genuine curiosity. Who is he really, beyond the rancher and empire builder? Cole was silent for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. He's a complicated man. He wasn't always like this, so cold, so calculating. When my mother was alive, he was different, still ambitious, still driven, but with a warmth that balanced it. She had a way of reminding him that people mattered more than property, that success without humanity was just another kind of poverty. What happened when she died? He hardened, threw himself into expansion, into building bigger and bigger. I think, Cole paused, seeming to work through difficult thoughts. I think losing her broke something in him, made him believe that caring about people was weakness, that attachment led to pain. So he stopped caring, stopped seeing individuals, and started seeing resources. The ranch became everything, not a home, not even really a business, but a monument, a way of leaving a mark that couldn't be erased the way she was erased. Eleanor heard the pain in his voice, the grief for a father who'd become someone almost unrecognizable. And you're caught between who he was and who he's become. Yes, exactly that. I keep hoping I'll see glimpses of the man he used to be, the father I remember from childhood. Sometimes I do. Brief moments when something reminds him of her, when his guard drops. But mostly, he's just ruthless, efficient, cold. Cole turned to look at her directly. I don't want to become that. I don't want building an empire to cost me my humanity. Then don't, Eleanor said simply. Choose differently. Be a different kind of man. Even if it costs me my inheritance, my place in the family business, my father's approval? Especially then, because those things, they're just things, Cole. Power, property, approval from someone whose values you don't share. What matters is who you are when you look at yourself in the mirror, whether you can respect the choices you've made. She reached for his hand, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them. Your mother understood that. She tried to teach you that. Honor her memory by living according to what she valued, not what grief has twisted your father into valuing. Cole's fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, might put into words the feelings that had been building between them through the long winter months. But Thomas called from the barn, something about the cow that needed attention, and the moment passed, filed away with all the other almost conversations they'd been having. Christmas arrived cold and bright, the sun reflecting off snow so blindingly white that it hurt to look at directly. Eleanor had almost nothing to give her siblings. Small things she'd made from scraps, a story she'd written out carefully on precious paper, promises of better times to come. But Cole appeared on Christmas Eve with a bundle that transformed their humble celebration into something magical. There were real store-bought presents, a pocket knife for Thomas, a book of fairy tales for Margaret, a carved wooden horse for Samuel. There were treats they hadn't tasted in months, crystallized ginger, peppermint candy, dried apricots. There was a new shawl for Eleanor, soft wool dyed a deep blue that made her gasp with its simple beauty. Cole, this is too much, she protested, even as Margaret hugged her new book and Samuel galloped his horse across the floor with delighted sound effects. It's Christmas, he said simply, and you're my friends. Let me do this, Eleanor. Let me give your family a good Christmas, one they'll remember when times are hard. So she did, setting aside pride to accept generosity, watching her siblings' joy and feeling her own heart expand with gratitude and something deeper, something that felt dangerously like love. They spent Christmas evening together, all 5 of them crowded into the small cabin, reading from Margaret's new book, playing with Samuel's horse, listening to Thomas demonstrate all the uses of his new knife. Cole taught them a song his mother used to sing at Christmas, his voice rough but earnest, creating a memory that would stay with all of them long after the evening ended. When it was time for him to leave, Eleanor walked him out to his horse. The night was crystal clear, stars scattered across the sky in impossible profusion, the kind of night that made the Montana Territory seem less like a harsh frontier and more like a place of wild beauty. Thank you, Eleanor said, inadequate words for everything she felt. For all of this. For being here. For caring about us. Cole looked down at her, his face partially shadowed but his eyes catching starlight. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Need you to understand, but before he could finish, a rider appeared from the darkness, approaching fast. Cole tensed, his hand going instinctively to his pistol before recognizing the figure. Mr. Cole! It was one of the Merrick ranch hands, his horse lathered despite the cold. Your father sent me. Says you need to come back immediately. Says there's important business that can't wait. Cole's jaw tightened with frustration. It's Christmas Eve. What business can't wait until morning? Don't know, sir. Just know he was real insistent. Said to tell you it concerns the gathering, and guests arriving early, and decisions that need your input. The ranch hand looked uncomfortable delivering the message. Said to tell you it wasn't a request. For a moment, Eleanor thought Cole might refuse, might send the man back with a message that he'd come when he was ready. But she saw the resignation settle over him, the weight of duty and obligation pulling him back toward a world that didn't value the things he was coming to hold most dear. I have to go, he said quietly, his eyes still on Eleanor. But I'll be back as soon as I can. And Eleanor, He reached for her hand, squeezed it gently. Don't let anyone tell you this land isn't yours. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here. Promise me. I promise, she said, though unease whispered through her at the intensity in his voice, the sense that he knew something she didn't, that trouble was approaching faster than any of them were ready for. She watched him ride away into the darkness, his figure disappearing into the vast Montana night, and felt the first real tremor of fear. Not the everyday fear of survival she'd lived with for months, but something larger, more ominous. The sense that the careful balance they'd been maintaining was about to tip, that forces beyond their control were gathering, that the battle Cole had warned about was no longer approaching, but had arrived. Inside the cabin, her siblings were settling down to sleep, their Christmas joy still glowing warm around them. Eleanor stood in the doorway, looking out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep, and made herself a promise that echoed the one Cole had extracted from her. Whatever came next, whatever Barrett Merrick had planned, she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender this home, this family, this life they'd built from nothing. The stakes had been raised. The real fight was beginning. And Eleanor Wade, at 22, with 3 siblings depending on her and a heart that had started hoping for impossible things, was about to discover exactly how much courage she possessed and exactly how high a price the Montana Territory demanded from those who dared to claim it as home. The week that followed Christmas passed with agonizing slowness, each day marked by Cole's absence and the growing certainty that something was wrong. Eleanor kept herself busy with the endless tasks of winter survival, but her eyes constantly drifted toward the northern horizon, watching for a rider who didn't come. On the 3rd day, Thomas rode their old mare into the small settlement 15 miles south, ostensibly to trade eggs for lamp oil, but really to gather news. He returned with information that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Everyone's talking about the Merrick gathering, Thomas reported, his young face troubled as he helped Eleanor prepare supper. They say every major rancher in the territory is there, plus territorial officials, even a judge. They're saying Barrett Merrick is making some kind of big announcement about land development and expansion. Eleanor's hands stilled over the potatoes she was peeling. What kind of announcement? Nobody knows for sure, but there's talk about consolidating claims, about some legal challenges to homesteader properties. Mrs. Henderson at the trading post said her husband heard that Merrick's been buying up questionable land claims, offering settlers money to leave before he has to force them out through the courts. Thomas paused, his voice dropping. Eleanor, she asked if we'd been approached yet. She seemed worried for us. Margaret, who'd been listening while pretending to read, looked up sharply. Does that mean Mr. Cole's father is going to try to buy our land? Or take it, Thomas said bluntly, his 12-year-old pragmatism cutting through any pretense. That's what it means when someone challenges your claim, right? They're saying you don't really own it, so they can take it. Eleanor forced herself to continue peeling potatoes, to keep her hands steady even as her mind raced. She'd known this was coming, Cole had warned her, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. The abstract threat had become concrete, and with Cole trapped at his father's gathering, unable to help or even provide information, she felt more alone than she had since her parents died. We're not selling, she said firmly, as much for her own benefit as her siblings. And we're not letting anyone take what's ours. Papa started the claim, we've lived here and worked this land. That has to count for something. But even as she spoke the words, doubt whispered through her. She'd seen how the world worked, how power and money could reshape reality to suit those who possessed them. Her father's incomplete paperwork, their poverty, their lack of connections or resources to fight a legal battle, all of it made them vulnerable in ways that righteous anger couldn't fix. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor pulled out the box of papers her father had left behind. She'd looked through them before, but never with such desperate attention, never trying to decipher the legal language and official stamps with such urgent need to understand. The homestead claim was there, partially completed, her father's careful handwriting filling in spaces on forms that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. There were receipts for filing fees, a surveyor's rough map, letters of intent, pieces of a process that had been interrupted by influenza and never resumed. Was it enough? Eleanor had no idea. The territorial land laws were complex, designed by people back east who'd never seen this country, never understood what it took to carve a home from this harsh landscape. She could read the words but couldn't interpret whether they added up to legal ownership or just expensive failure. She needed help. She needed someone who understood the law, who could tell her whether her family's claim would stand up to the kind of challenge Barrett Merrick could mount. She needed exactly what Cole had offered: a lawyer, professional guidance, the resources to fight properly. But Cole was trapped at his father's gathering, and pride had kept her from accepting his help when he'd offered it. Pride seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. The decision made, Eleanor felt some of the paralyzing fear transform into something more manageable. Still present, still heavy, but no longer completely immobilizing. She would go to the territorial land office herself. She would take their papers, explain their situation, find out what needed to be done to secure their claim. It would mean leaving the children for at least 2 days, would mean spending precious money on the journey, would mean venturing into official spaces where her poverty and gender might work against her. But sitting here waiting for disaster felt infinitely worse than taking action, even uncertain action. She was still planning the trip when the riders came. It was mid-morning, 3 days after Thomas's information-gathering trip. Eleanor was outside, hanging laundry despite the bitter cold, the task necessary regardless of weather. Margaret was helping, her small hands red with cold as she handed up clothespins, when they heard the horses. 4 men, riding in formation that spoke of purpose rather than casual travel. They wore good coats and better boots, the kind of men who worked for wealthy operations and knew their position gave them power. Eleanor recognized the brand on their horses, the Merrick Ranch mark, distinctive and unmistakable. Her first thought was for the rifle, still inside the cabin. Her second was for the children, Thomas working in the barn, Samuel playing nearby, Margaret frozen beside her with sudden fear in her eyes. She forced herself to remain calm, to set down the wet shirt she'd been about to hang and face these men with as much dignity as she could muster. The lead rider was older, maybe 50, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades enforcing other people's will. He tipped his hat with mocking courtesy as he reined his horse to a stop. "Miss Wade, I presume." "This is my property," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "State your business or move along." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Hutchins, ma'am. I'm the foreman for the Merrick Ranch. Mr. Barrett Merrick asked me to deliver a message." "I'm not interested in anything Barrett Merrick has to say." Eleanor moved slightly, positioning herself between the riders and Margaret. "You can tell your employer that if he has business with me, he can present it through proper legal channels." Hutchins' smile widened, enjoying her defiance in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Now that's the thing, ma'am. Mr. Merrick is using proper legal channels. He's filed a territorial claim challenge, stating that your occupation of this land is invalid due to incomplete documentation and failure to maintain proper homestead requirements. You'll be served with official papers within the week, and there will be a hearing before Judge Morrison in 45 days. The words hit like physical blows. 45 days. Not enough time to properly prepare. Barely enough time to find legal help, clearly calculated to give her minimal opportunity to mount a defense. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, but refused to show weakness in front of these men. "My father filed his claim properly. We've maintained continuous occupation. We've improved the land. The law, Hutchins interrupted smoothly, requires complete documentation, proper filing of all necessary forms, and adherence to specific improvement requirements. Mr. Merrick's lawyers have reviewed your father's paperwork, or rather the lack thereof, and believe your claim is deficient. The judge will make the final determination, of course, but I'd say you're looking at an uphill battle, ma'am." "How did Barrett Merrick get access to my father's paperwork?" Eleanor demanded, anger burning through fear. "Those are private documents. Territorial land records are public information, ma'am. Anyone can review them. Mr. Merrick's attorneys are very thorough." Hutchins leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to something that pretended at sympathy but felt more like threat. "Look, Miss Wade, I'm authorized to make you an offer. Mr. Merrick will pay you $500 for this property, more than fair considering the condition of the cabin and the minimal improvements. That money could set you up somewhere else, somewhere with better opportunities. You could take your siblings back east, give them proper schooling, a real chance at life." $500. It was more money than Eleanor had ever possessed, more than she could earn in years of backbreaking labor. It was also insulting, a fraction of what the land was worth to someone who understood its strategic value, a pittance offered to people assumed to be desperate enough to accept anything. "This land is not for sale at any price," Eleanor said coldly, "and I'll thank you to leave my property immediately." Hutchins straightened, his false sympathy evaporating. "That's your choice, ma'am, but I'd think carefully about what's best for those children you're responsible for. Fighting Mr. Merrick in court costs money, money for lawyers, money for filing fees, money you clearly don't have. And even if you could afford it, you'd lose. The law's on his side, and he's got the resources to prove it. All you'd accomplish is wasting what little you have left and ending up with nothing anyway." "Get off my land!" Eleanor's voice shook with rage she could no longer contain. "Get off, and tell Barrett Merrick that he can take his offer and his threats, and—" "Eleanor." Thomas had emerged from the barn, her uncle's rifle held with steady competence despite his young age. He didn't point it at the men, but the implied threat was clear. "These men were just leaving, weren't they?" Hutchins' expression darkened as he took in the armed boy, the calculation shifting behind his eyes. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might escalate, might challenge Thomas's right to even hold the weapon. But then he seemed to think better of it, perhaps remembering that whatever else they were, the Wades were within their rights to defend their property from unwelcome visitors. "We're leaving," Hutchins said, his tone now openly hostile. "But you'll be seeing us again, Miss Wade, at the hearing when Judge Morrison rules in Mr. Merrick's favor and this land becomes ranch property. I'd start packing if I were you. Makes leaving easier when the time comes." They rode off, taking their threats with them, but leaving behind a residue of fear that contaminated the winter air. Eleanor stood frozen until they disappeared from sight. Then her legs gave out, and she sank onto the bench her father had built, her whole body shaking with reaction. Margaret pressed against her side, crying softly. Thomas stayed standing, rifle still held ready, his young face set in lines that made him look far older than 12. Even Samuel had gone quiet, his child's instinct sensing the danger that had just passed through their yard. "They're really going to take our home," Margaret whispered. "Aren't they?" Eleanor wanted to offer reassurance, wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that the law would protect them, that right would prevail over might. But the lies stuck in her throat, false comfort that would make the eventual truth harder to bear. "They're going to try," she said instead, pulling Margaret close. "But we're going to fight. We're going to fight with everything we have." "How?" Thomas asked, his pragmatism cutting straight to the heart of the problem. "We don't have money for a lawyer. We don't know the law. How do we fight someone like Barrett Merrick?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted. "But I know we can't just surrender. I know that giving up means losing for certain, while fighting at least gives us a chance." She looked at her siblings, these 3 children who'd already lost so much, who were depending on her to somehow fix the unfixable. "We're going to that territorial land office. We're going to find out exactly what we need to do to prove our claim is valid. And we're going to do it." "What about Mr. Cole?" Margaret asked. "Won't he help us?" Eleanor's heart clenched at the name. Where was Cole in all this? Did he know his father had already filed the challenge? Already sent men to threaten and intimidate? Was he party to this strategy, despite all his words about caring, about making sure they could stay? Or was he as trapped by his father's machinations as they were by their poverty? "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly. "I don't know what Cole knows, or what he can do, or whether he'll even try to help us once his father has made his intentions this clear. But we can't count on him, Margaret. We can't count on anyone but ourselves." The words hurt to say, acknowledging the possibility that Cole's kindness had been temporary, conditional, unable to survive the test of real conflict with his father. But Eleanor forced herself to face that possibility, to plan as if they were truly alone, to not let hope in Cole's help become dependence that would shatter when it proved misplaced. They spent the rest of the day in a kind of shocked suspension, going through necessary tasks with automatic efficiency while their minds grappled with this new reality. Eleanor made plans. She would leave for the territorial office at first light, would take what money they had and pray it was enough for the journey and whatever fees were required. Thomas would stay with the children, would keep them safe and fed and protected until she returned. It wasn't ideal, leaving them even briefly, but she saw no alternative. The challenge had been filed, the timeline set. They had 45 days, and every one of them mattered. Night had fallen, supper had been eaten in near silence, and Eleanor was helping Samuel prepare for bed when she heard the horse. Her body tensed instinctively, fear spiking at the thought of more Merrick ranch hands returning with additional threats. But then she recognized the rhythm of the hoofbeats, the particular sound of a horse she'd come to know over the long winter months. Cole. She met him at the door, relief and anger warring in her chest. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with lines that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him, his eyes carrying a burden of knowledge that made her stomach clench with dread. "Eleanor," he said, swinging down from his horse with weary grace. "Thank God you're all right. I came as soon as I could get away." "Your father's men were here," Eleanor said without preamble. "They threatened us, told us we'd be evicted, that Barrett Merrick has filed a legal challenge to our claim." She crossed her arms, holding herself together through sheer will. "Did you know?" Cole's expression crumpled, pain and guilt written across his features. "Not until 3 days ago. My father kept me occupied with the gathering, made sure I was always in meetings or entertaining guests or dealing with ranch business. By the time I found out what he was planning, he'd already filed the challenge, already sent Hutchins and his men to intimidate you. Eleanor, I swear to you I would have stopped this if I'd known. I would have warned you, helped you prepare." "But you didn't know," Eleanor interrupted, her voice flat with the effort of controlling her emotions. "Because your father made sure you didn't. Because even in your own family, you're kept in the dark when it matters. So what good are you to us, Cole? What good are your promises and your concern when your father can simply work around you to destroy us?" The words were harsh, harsher than she'd intended, but exhaustion and fear had eroded her usual restraint. Cole absorbed them without flinching, accepting the blow as deserved. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been naive, thinking I could influence my father from within, thinking my objections would matter when money and power were at stake. I've been playing at rebellion while still accepting the privileges of my position, still taking his money and living under his roof and pretending that made me somehow separate from his actions." He stepped closer, his voice intense with conviction. "But that ends now. I'm here to help you fight this, Eleanor. I have money my mother left me, money my father can't touch. We'll hire the best lawyer in the territory. We'll make sure your claim is properly filed and documented. We'll fight this challenge with everything we have." "Why?" The question came out rawer than Eleanor intended, all her confusion and hurt and desperate hope packed into one syllable. "Why would you do that? Why would you go against your own father, risk your inheritance, your future for us?" Cole's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch, something beyond friendship or neighborly concern, something deep and true and terrifying in its intensity. "Because I love you," he said simply. "Because I love this family, this place, what you've built here. Because watching you fight for your home has shown me what actually matters in life. And it's not empires or inheritances or my father's approval. It's this: people caring for each other, building something real, standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything." He reached for her hand and she let him take it, let herself feel the warmth and strength there. "I'm done trying to change him from within. I'm done pretending I can serve two masters. I choose you, Eleanor. I choose this family. Whatever that costs me, whatever that means for my relationship with my father, I choose this." Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes, emotion threatening to overwhelm the careful control she'd maintained all day. Part of her wanted to fall into his arms, to accept this declaration and the help he offered and let someone else carry part of the burden she'd been shouldering alone. But another part, the part that had learned how dangerous hope could be, held back. "Your father won't accept that," she said. "He'll see it as betrayal. He'll cut you off, disinherit you, make sure you have nothing." "Then I'll have nothing," Cole said with fierce certainty. "I'll work with my hands, I'll build something of my own, I'll live without the Merrick name and money and power. But I won't live without honor. I won't live knowing I stood by while my father destroyed good people just to add another section to his empire." Thomas appeared in the doorway, having heard enough to understand what was being offered. "You'd really do that?" You'd give up everything to help us? Cole turned to face the boy, speaking to him with the same respect he'd always shown. Yes, because everything I'd be giving up, money, position, an inheritance built on taking from others, isn't worth keeping if it means losing who I am. Your family has taught me that. Your sister has taught me that. My father used to say you can judge a man by what he's willing to lose for what he believes in, Thomas said slowly. I think he would have liked you, Mr. Cole. Something shifted in the cabin's atmosphere, tension releasing slightly as acceptance began to replace suspicion. Margaret emerged from the sleeping area, having listened from the shadows, and walked straight to Cole with her characteristic directness. If you're going to fight for us, if you're going to go against your father and risk everything, then you should know something. She looked up at him with eyes too serious for 10 years old. Eleanor loves you too. She doesn't say it, but I can tell. So you're not just fighting for neighbors or people you feel sorry for. You're fighting for family. The family you're choosing, the family you want to be part of. That's important. That matters. Margaret! Eleanor's face flamed with embarrassment, but her sister just shrugged. It's true, and everyone knows it, so we might as well say it out loud. Besides, Mr. Cole just said he loves you, and you didn't say it back, and that's not fair to him. The simple childhood logic of it broke something loose in Eleanor's chest. She'd been so focused on survival, on protecting her siblings, on maintaining the walls that kept her upright and functional, that she'd barely let herself acknowledge her own feelings. But Margaret was right. Cole had laid his heart bare, had offered everything he had, and she owed him the same honesty. I do, Eleanor said quietly, meeting Cole's eyes. I do love you. I've been trying not to, because it seemed impossible, because our situations were too different, because hoping for something more felt like inviting heartbreak. But Margaret's right. I love you. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see people as people instead of resources. I love how you are with my siblings, how you've made this place feel less lonely, how you've given us back hope when I thought we'd lost it forever. Cole closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Eleanor let herself lean into his strength, let herself accept comfort and support, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they weren't facing this fight alone. We'll get through this, Cole murmured against her hair. Together, we'll make sure your claim stands. We'll fight my father's challenge and win. And when it's over, when this land is legally and completely yours, I'm going to ask you a question. But first, we handle this. Eleanor pulled back just enough to see his face. What question? Cole's smile was soft, full of promise. One thing at a time. First, we secure your home. Then, we talk about the future. He glanced at the 3 children watching them with expressions ranging from Margaret's satisfaction to Samuel's confusion to Thomas's cautious optimism. The future for all of us. The meaning behind his words settled warm in Eleanor's chest. Not just a romantic future for the 2 of them, but a family future, all 5 of them together, building something that honored both what they'd survived and what they hoped to create. It was more than she'd let herself dream of, more than seemed possible, given the obstacles ahead. But with Cole beside her, with his resources and determination added to her own stubborn courage, maybe it wasn't impossible after all. They spent the rest of the evening making plans. Cole would ride to the territorial capital first thing in the morning, would hire the best land lawyer his money could secure. He'd get copies of all relevant territorial laws and precedents, would find out exactly what was needed to prove their claim valid beyond challenge. Meanwhile, Eleanor would gather every piece of documentation her father had left. Receipts, letters, the partial claim filing, anything that proved their family's relationship to this land. There's something else, Cole said as they worked through the logistics. The hearing will be before Judge Morrison. He's not corrupt exactly, but he's influenced by power and money. We'll need more than just legal arguments. We'll need public support, testimony from other homesteaders, evidence that the community values your presence here. We'll need to make this about more than just one claim. Make it about the principle of whether big ranchers can simply take land from working families through legal intimidation. You're talking about making this political, Thomas observed. I'm talking about fighting smart, Cole corrected. My father has money and lawyers and connections. We have the moral high ground, and the truth. We need to make sure those things matter more in the courtroom than they usually do. They worked late into the night, building strategy from hope and determination and precious little actual legal knowledge. But the process itself felt important, taking action instead of just reacting, planning instead of just surviving, standing up instead of being pushed down. By the time Cole finally left with promises to return as soon as he had information, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not just hope, but actual confidence that they might prevail. "You really think we can win this?" Thomas asked after Cole had ridden off, his question carrying all his accumulated fears and doubts. Eleanor pulled her brother close, this boy who'd been forced to become a man too quickly. "I think we have a chance. I think we have help now, and I think we're not going to let Barrett Merrick take our home without the fight of his life. That has to count for something." In the days that followed, their cabin became the center of a growing resistance. Cole returned with a lawyer named Samuel Harrison, a thin, intense man who'd made his reputation defending homesteaders against exactly the kind of territorial power plays Barrett Merrick specialized in. Harrison spent hours reviewing their documents, asking questions about their occupation and improvements, building a case that relied less on completed paperwork and more on the spirit of homestead law. "The territorial statutes are clear," Harrison explained in his precise way. "Continuous occupation, good faith improvement of the land, and intent to establish a permanent home. These are the core requirements. Your father's incomplete filing is a problem, yes, but not necessarily fatal. What matters more is proving that you've met the essential criteria regardless of bureaucratic formalities." "Can we prove that?" Eleanor asked. "I believe so. You've lived here continuously since your father's death, maintaining and improving the property. You've established yourselves in the community, engaged in local trade, sent your siblings to the occasional traveling teacher. These things matter. They show genuine homesteading rather than speculative claiming." Harrison paused, his expression growing more serious. "The challenge, however, is that Barrett Merrick's lawyers will argue that your father's death interrupted the legal continuity of the claim. That as a single woman without legal authority as head of household, you can't simply inherit his incomplete filing. That's where we'll face our strongest opposition." The words hit Eleanor like cold water. As a woman, her legal standing was complicated in ways a man's wouldn't be. The laws were written with male heads of household in mind, with women and children as dependents rather than independent claimants. It was yet another way the world was stacked against them, yet another obstacle that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with arbitrary rules designed to maintain certain power structures. "So what do we do?" she asked, refusing to let this new knowledge defeat her. "We argue that you, as the eldest surviving family member and the one maintaining the household, have effective authority. We show that you've been managing this property competently, that you've met every homestead requirement through your own labor and decision-making. We make the case that the law's intent, to give working people the opportunity to establish homes, is more important than its male-centric language." Harrison's thin smile held a hint of satisfaction. "I've won similar arguments before. It's not easy, but it's possible." Over the following weeks, they built their case piece by piece. Harrison filed responses to Barrett Merrick's challenge, establishing their counter-arguments in the legal record. Cole used his connections to gather supporting testimony from other homesteaders, from merchants who'd traded with Eleanor, from anyone who could speak to the Wade family's legitimate occupation of their land. They tracked down the surveyor who'd done the original boundary work for Eleanor's father, securing his testimony that the claim had been properly measured and marked. And through it all, the personal cost to Cole became increasingly apparent. His father had learned of his son's involvement in the Wade defense, and the response was swift and brutal. Cole arrived at their cabin one evening with a black eye and bruised knuckles, the evidence of a confrontation that had apparently moved beyond words. "He said I was a traitor," Cole reported, accepting the cool cloth Eleanor pressed to his face. "Said I was throwing away my birthright for a woman and 3 brats who weren't even my concern. Said he'd make sure I regretted choosing them over family." "You should go back," Eleanor said, though the words cost her. "You should make peace with him. We can find another way to fight this." "There is no other way," Cole said flatly, "and I'm not going back. I've moved into the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. My father made it clear I'm not welcome in the main house. I'm working for wages now, same as any other hired man. It's actually liberating, knowing I'm earning my keep through my own labor rather than just inheriting privilege. But Eleanor saw this pain beneath his pragmatic words, the grief of losing a father who was still alive, the cost of standing by his principles. She wanted to make it easier for him, wanted to somehow solve this without him having to sacrifice so much. But there was no middle path here, no compromise that would preserve both their land and Cole's relationship with his father. Barrett Merrick had made this a binary choice, and Cole had chosen them. The weight of that choice, of what Cole was willing to lose for them, settled heavy on Eleanor's shoulders. It was one thing to fight for your own family, your own survival. It was entirely another to accept someone else's sacrifice, to know that their presence in your life had cost them something irreplaceable. She found herself thinking about Cole's mother, about the woman who'd taught her son that character mattered more than wealth, that integrity was worth more than empire. She wished she could have met her, could have thanked her for raising a son capable of this kind of courage. 3 weeks before the scheduled hearing, they received news that shifted the landscape again. Barrett Merrick had filed a motion to accelerate the hearing date, claiming that the uncertain land status was interfering with his ranch operations and that justice delayed was justice denied. The motion was granted, moving the hearing up by 2 weeks and giving them even less time to prepare. "It's a tactical move," Harrison explained grimly. "He's trying to catch us unprepared, trying to limit our time to gather evidence and build community support. It's also likely he's applied pressure to Judge Morrison to accommodate the request. We're dealing with a stacked deck here." "Then we'd better make sure we play our cards perfectly," Cole said, his voice hard with determination. "Because we're not losing this. We're not letting my father win just because he's rich and connected and willing to manipulate the system." They doubled their efforts, working 16-hour days to prepare. Eleanor practiced her testimony with Harrison, learning how to present her case clearly and compellingly. Thomas and Margaret were coached on what they might be asked if called to testify. Every document was reviewed, every witness statement refined, every possible question anticipated and prepared for. And through it all, Eleanor felt the growing certainty that this hearing would determine more than just land ownership. It would determine what kind of territory Montana would become, whether it would be a place where working people could build homes and establish themselves, or whether it would be controlled by a few wealthy men who saw land as nothing more than property to accumulate. Their small claim had become symbolic of a larger struggle, and the outcome would ripple far beyond their single homestead. The night before they were scheduled to leave for the territorial seat where the hearing would take place, Eleanor stood outside the cabin looking at the land that had become home. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns about ownership and justice. The creek that ran through their property sang its winter song, unchanged by legal challenges and power struggles. The land itself didn't care who claimed it, who fought over it, who won or lost in courtrooms far away. But Eleanor cared. She cared with an intensity that surprised her, a fierce possessiveness that went beyond mere survival. This land represented freedom, possibility, the chance to build something real. It was where her parents were buried, where her siblings had grown, where she'd learned who she could be when pushed to her limits. It was home in the deepest sense, and no amount of money or legal maneuvering could make her willingly surrender it. Cole found her there, joining her in the cold darkness. They stood together in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, drawing strength from proximity. "Tomorrow, we start fighting for real," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we finish what we started," Eleanor corrected. "We've been fighting since the moment your father filed that challenge. Tomorrow we just make it official." "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "But I'm also angry and determined and absolutely certain we're on the right side of this fight. That has to count for something." Cole pulled her close, and Eleanor let herself lean into his strength one more time before the battle began. Tomorrow, they would face Barrett Merrick's wealth and power and legal maneuvering. They would stand before a judge who might or might not care about justice over connections. They would fight for something that should never have needed fighting for, the right to keep the home they'd built through sacrifice and stubbornness and love. But tonight, for a few more hours, they could stand together in the darkness, drawing courage from each other, believing that morning would bring not just another challenge, but the beginning of victory. The stars watched overhead and the land waited beneath their feet, and Eleanor Wade prepared to fight for both with everything she possessed. The territorial capital emerged from the plains like a promise or a threat, depending on perspective. Buildings of rough-hewn lumber and occasional brick stood against the enormous sky, declaring human ambition in a landscape that dwarfed such pretensions. Eleanor sat in the wagon beside Cole, her siblings huddled behind them, wrapped in blankets against the February cold, and tried to control the fear that had been building with each mile of the 2-day journey. She'd left her cabin only a handful of times since her parents died, and never for anything as consequential as this. The capital felt foreign and intimidating, full of people who moved with purpose and certainty, who belonged in ways she feared she never would. But she straightened her spine and lifted her chin, refusing to let her anxiety show. Her siblings were watching, and they needed to see strength, not doubt. "We'll stay at the boarding house on 3rd Street, Cole said, guiding the wagon through streets that seemed impossibly crowded after months of isolation. "Harrison arranged rooms for us. The hearing is tomorrow at 10 in the territorial courthouse. We'll meet with him this evening to review everything one final time." Eleanor nodded, taking in the details of this town that would determine their fate. She saw other homesteaders mixed among the merchants and officials, recognized them by their worn clothes and weathered faces, by the way they moved carefully through spaces that weren't quite theirs. She wondered how many of them had faced challenges like hers, how many had won, how many had lost everything to men like Barrett Merrick. The boarding house was modest but clean, run by a woman named Mrs. Chen, who took one look at Eleanor's exhausted siblings and immediately offered hot soup and fresh bread. The kindness was unexpected and nearly broke Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. She'd been braced for hostility or indifference, not maternal concern from a stranger. "You're the Homesteader family fighting Barrett Merrick," Mrs. Chen said as she ladled soup into bowls. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast. Half the territory's been talking about it." "Is that good or bad?" Thomas asked, his 12-year-old pragmatism cutting straight to the relevant question. Mrs. Chen's expression was difficult to read. "Depends who you ask. Homesteaders are cheering for you. You're fighting the fight a lot of them wish they could fight. The ranchers and businessmen? They're mostly on Merrick's side. They see this as about property rights and legal procedure, don't much care about the human cost." She set the last bowl down, her gaze settling on Eleanor with unexpected intensity. "But Judge Morrison? He's harder to predict. He's ruled for homesteaders before, when the law was clearly on their side. He's also ruled for ranchers when money talked louder than justice. You'll need more than legal arguments tomorrow. You'll need to make him see you as people, not just another case number." The words settled heavy in Eleanor's chest, adding another layer of pressure to what was already overwhelming. It wasn't enough to have the law on their side. They had to be sympathetic, compelling, human enough to matter. She thought about her worn dress, her calloused hands, the way her siblings looked too thin despite their improving circumstances. Would that inspire sympathy or just confirm prejudices about homesteaders as unsuccessful, barely surviving, not worth the effort of defending? Harrison arrived that evening as promised, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with documents and a nervous energy that did nothing to calm Eleanor's fears. They gathered in the small parlor of the boarding house, and he laid out their strategy with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. "Barrett Merrick will present first," Harrison explained, spreading papers across the small table. "His lawyers will argue that your father's claim was never properly completed, that his death severed any legal continuity, and that as a single woman without a male head of household, you lack the standing to inherit or maintain the claim. They'll present this as a simple matter of following proper procedure. No malice, just legal necessity." "But that's not what this is really about," Cole interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is about my father wanting land he sees as strategically valuable. The legal arguments are just the tool he's using." "Of course," Harrison agreed, "but we can't argue motive in court. We can only argue law and fact. So here's our counter strategy. We acknowledge that the original filing was incomplete, but we argue that the essential requirements of homestead law have been met. Continuous occupation, good faith improvements, community integration, the intent to establish a permanent home. We present Eleanor not as someone trying to inherit a claim, but as someone who has actively maintained and improved the property in her own right, making her the de facto claimant regardless of the paperwork history. Will that work? Margaret asked, her young voice cutting through the legal jargon to the question that mattered. Harrison's pause was too long, too calculated. It should work. The law supports it. The precedents lean our way. But he glanced at Cole, some unspoken communication passing between them. Judge Morrison is susceptible to influence. We need to be prepared for the possibility that legal merit won't be enough. You're saying he might rule against us even if we're right, Thomas said flatly. I'm saying we need to make it as difficult as possible for him to do that. We need witnesses, community support, evidence that makes the injustice of ruling against you absolutely clear. We need to make this about more than just one homestead, make it about what kind of territory Montana wants to be. Harrison's intensity increased, his thin frame practically vibrating with conviction. Tomorrow, when you testify, Eleanor, you're not just defending your claim. You're defending every homesteader who's ever tried to build something against the odds. Make Judge Morrison understand that. Make everyone in that courtroom understand that. The weight of it pressed down on Eleanor like physical force. She was 22 years old, exhausted from months of struggle, terrified of losing everything. And now she was supposed to be a symbol, a representative, someone whose words would matter beyond her own small family's fate. It felt like too much, like more than she could possibly carry. But then she felt Cole's hand find hers under the table, steady and warm. She looked at her siblings, Margaret trying so hard to be brave, Thomas pretending he wasn't scared, Samuel barely understanding but trusting absolutely in his big sister's ability to fix things. They were counting on her, not to be perfect, not to be some grand symbol, but just to stand up and tell the truth about what they'd survived and built and why it mattered. That, at least, she could do. They reviewed testimony late into the night, Harrison coaching her on how to answer questions clearly and directly, how to avoid legal traps that Merrick's lawyers would set, how to present herself as competent without seeming threatening to men who might resent a woman's independence. It was exhausting and humiliating in equal measure, this careful performance required to have her basic rights acknowledged. But Eleanor forced herself to learn it, to practice it, to become whoever she needed to be to win this fight. When Harrison finally left and the children were settled in bed, Eleanor stood at the window of their small room and looked out at the territorial capital's scattered lights. Somewhere in this town, Barrett Merrick was also preparing for tomorrow. He was probably confident, secure in his wealth and connections, certain that the system would work in his favor, as it always had. The thought made her angry, and she held on to that anger, let it burn away some of the fear. Better to face tomorrow furious than terrified. Cole found her there, as he always seemed to find her in moments when she needed not to be alone. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her in the darkness, his presence a comfort she'd stopped questioning. What if we lose? The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it, the fear she'd been suppressing finally breaking through. What if Morrison rules for your father and we lose everything? Where do we go? What do we do? We don't lose, Cole said with quiet certainty. You can't know that. Harrison basically admitted the judge might rule against us regardless of the law. Then we appeal. We take it to territorial Supreme Court if we have to. We fight until there's nowhere left to fight. Cole turned to face her, his hands settling on her shoulders. Eleanor, listen to me. I meant what I said before. I choose you. I choose this family. That doesn't change based on tomorrow's outcome. If we lose the homestead, we'll find other land. We'll start over somewhere else. It'll be harder, and it'll take time, but we'll do it together. I don't want other land, Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. I want our land. The land my father claimed, where my parents are buried, where we've fought so hard to stay. I want home, Cole. Not some substitute, not a fresh start somewhere else. I want the home we already have. I know, and we're going to fight like hell to keep it. He pulled her close, and Eleanor let herself lean into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. But I need you to hear this. Losing the land doesn't mean losing your home. Your home is your family, Thomas and Margaret and Samuel. Your home is the people you love and who love you back. The land matters, but it's not what defines you. You define it by choosing to fight for it. The words settled into Eleanor's chest, not quite comfort, but something close. Perspective, maybe, or the reminder that some things couldn't be taken regardless of court rulings. Her siblings, the family they'd maintained against impossible odds, The strength she'd discovered in herself through months of hardship, those were hers absolutely, untouchable by Barrett Merrick or any judge. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here, for fighting with us, for making this feel less impossible." "Thank you for letting me," Cole replied, "for trusting me despite everything my father's done, for seeing me as separate from his sins." They stood together in the darkness, and Eleanor let herself imagine for a moment what could come after tomorrow. If they won, if the judge ruled in their favor and their land was confirmed absolutely as theirs, what then? Cole had mentioned a question he wanted to ask, a future he wanted to discuss. She thought she knew what that question would be, and the thought made her heart race with mingled hope and terror. The idea of building a life with him, of combining their families formally instead of just circumstantially, of having a partner in all the ways that mattered, it was everything she'd stopped letting herself want. But first, tomorrow. First, the fight that would determine whether any future was possible. Morning arrived too quickly, dragging Eleanor from restless sleep into cold reality. She dressed carefully in her best dress, which wasn't saying much, but at least it was clean and mended, and helped her siblings prepare. They would all attend the hearing, Harrison had decided. The judge needed to see the whole family, needed to understand exactly what was at stake. The territorial courthouse was an imposing building of red brick, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Eleanor climbed its steps with her family around her and Cole beside her, feeling the weight of all the official proceedings that had happened here, all the lives shaped by decisions made within these walls. She thought of her parents, wondered what they would think of this moment, hoped they would be proud of how she'd fought for what they'd started. The courtroom was already filling when they entered. Eleanor saw Barrett Merrick immediately, impossible to miss, sitting in the front row with his expensive suit and air of absolute confidence. He was older than she'd imagined, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of weathered handsomeness that suggested a life lived largely outdoors. His eyes tracked them as they entered, and Eleanor saw the moment he recognized his son, saw something complicated flash across his face before it hardened into cold dismissal. Cole didn't acknowledge his father, didn't even glance in his direction. He stayed close to Eleanor, making his choice clear to everyone present. The statement was unmistakable, and Eleanor saw heads turn, saw whispers ripple through the assembled crowd. The Merrick heir standing with homesteaders against his own father. It was exactly the kind of gossip that would spread through the territory like wildfire. Judge Morrison entered precisely at 10, a severe-looking man in his 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that revealed nothing. He took his seat at the bench with the gravity of someone who understood the power he wielded, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with renewed anxiety. This man, this stranger, held their future in his hands. The injustice of it was staggering. "We're here to consider the matter of Merrick versus Wade," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded courtroom. "Mr. Merrick has filed a challenge to the homestead claim maintained by Miss Eleanor Wade, arguing that said claim is invalid due to incomplete documentation and improper transfer of authority following the death of the original claimant. Miss Wade contests this challenge. We'll hear arguments from both parties, beginning with the challenger. Mr. Pemberton, you may proceed." Barrett Merrick's lawyer was everything Eleanor had expected. Polished, confident, speaking in the kind of educated tones that suggested expensive schooling and natural authority. He laid out their case with clinical precision, presenting the Wade claim as nothing more than squatting dressed up in partial paperwork, presenting Eleanor as a woman overreaching her legal capacity. "The law is clear about homestead requirements," Pemberton argued, his voice rich with false sympathy. "Filing must be complete, documentation must be in order, and the claimant must maintain continuous occupation and improvement. Miss Wade's father failed to complete the necessary filing before his untimely death. Miss Wade herself, as an unmarried woman without legal standing as head of household, cannot simply inherit or continue a claim that was never properly established. This is not a question of fairness or sentiment. It's a question of following territorial law." He continued for nearly an hour, building a case that sounded reasonable if you ignored the human cost, that seemed logical if you didn't consider the purpose behind homestead law. He presented documents showing the incomplete filing, pointed to technicalities and procedures that hadn't been followed, made it sound as if the Wade family were trying to circumvent proper legal channels, rather than simply struggling to survive. Eleanor watched Judge Morrison as Pemberton spoke, trying to read his expression and finding nothing. The judge's face remained neutral, giving no indication of how the arguments were landing. Beside her, Cole's jaw was tight with tension, his hands clenched into fists. On her other side, Thomas sat rigid with the effort of staying quiet, of not objecting to the way their struggle was being characterized as legal negligence. When Pemberton finally finished and resumed his seat beside Barrett Merrick, Harrison stood with the controlled energy of someone preparing for battle. He was physically unimpressive compared to Merrick's polished lawyer. His suit was less expensive, his manner less naturally commanding. But when he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. Your Honor, Mr. Pemberton wants us to believe this case is about paperwork and procedure. It's not. This case is about whether homestead law exists to help working families establish homes, or whether it exists to create hoops that wealthy men can force poor families to jump through before taking their land. Harrison moved to stand directly before the bench, commanding attention through intensity rather than polish. The Wade family has done everything homestead law requires in spirit and substance. They've occupied the land continuously. They've improved it significantly. They've integrated into the local community. They've maintained it through hardship that would have broken most families. The fact that Eleanor Wade's father died before completing certain bureaucratic filings doesn't negate any of that. He laid out their case piece by piece, the surveyor's testimony about proper boundaries, the merchant's statements about the family's legitimate community presence, the physical evidence of improvements made. He presented Eleanor not as someone trying to inherit a claim, but as someone who had maintained and improved property through her own labor, making her the legitimate claimant regardless of her father's incomplete paperwork. Mr. Pemberton argues that Miss Wade lacks legal standing as an unmarried woman, Harrison continued, his voice sharpening, but homestead law doesn't require a male head of household. It requires a head of household, period. Eleanor Wade has functioned as head of household since her father's death. She's made all decisions regarding the property. She's entered into contracts for supplies and services. She's maintained the claim through her own competent management. The law doesn't require that household heads be male. That's just prejudice masquerading as legal principle. Eleanor saw Morrison's expression shift slightly at that, something that might have been interest or might have been offense. It was impossible to tell, and the uncertainty made her pulse race with anxiety. Harrison called witnesses throughout the morning, the surveyor, 2 neighboring homesteaders, Mrs. Henderson from the trading post. Each testified to the Wade family's legitimate occupation of their land, their visible improvements, their integration into the community. Each made the case that Eleanor had functioned effectively as the property's manager and that the family's claim was as valid as any other homesteader's regardless of paperwork technicalities. Then it was Eleanor's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. The oath was administered, and she swore to tell the truth with a voice that didn't quite shake. Harrison approached with an encouraging expression, his questions designed to let her tell their story in her own words. Miss Wade, please tell the court about your family's relationship to the land in question. Eleanor took a breath and began. She told them about her father claiming the land in 1880, about building the cabin with his own hands, about her mother planting the first garden. She described her childhood there, the memories embedded in every corner of that property. She spoke about the influenza that took her parents, about the choice she'd made to keep her siblings together rather than surrendering them to orphanages or relatives who didn't want the burden. She described the work of maintaining the homestead alone, the hunting and planting and repairs, the teaching and protecting and struggling to survive. Why didn't you complete your father's filing after he died? Harrison asked. I didn't know how, Eleanor answered honestly. My father handled those things. I was focused on keeping us alive, keeping us together. By the time I realized the filing wasn't complete, I didn't have money for a lawyer or resources to travel to the territorial office. I thought, she paused, fighting the emotion that threatened to choke her voice. I thought living there, working the land, building a home, I thought that would be enough. I thought if we earned it through labor and love and sacrifice, that would matter more than paperwork. And has it been enough? Have you succeeded in building a home there? Yes. Eleanor's voice grew stronger, more certain. We've not only survived, We've thrived. The cabin is solid and warm. The garden produces enough to sustain us. My siblings are educated and healthy. We're part of the community. We've built something real from almost nothing. That's what homesteading is supposed to be about, giving families the chance to build something through their own effort, and that's exactly what we've done. Harrison smiled slightly, satisfaction flickering across his face. Thank you, Miss Wade. Your witness, Mr. Pemberton. Merrick's lawyer stood with the air of someone preparing to destroy, and Eleanor braced herself for attack. Pemberton approached the witness stand with false courtesy that set her teeth on edge. Miss Wade, you've painted a very sympathetic picture, but let's discuss facts. You testified that you didn't complete your father's filing because you didn't know how and lacked resources. Isn't it true that the Territorial Land Office offers assistance with filing procedures? I didn't know that at the time, Eleanor said carefully. But ignorance of resources doesn't excuse failure to follow procedure, does it? I wasn't aware I was failing to follow procedure. I was focused on survival. Pemberton's smile was cold. Of course. But surely you understand that homestead law requires certain formalities for good reason, that allowing anyone to simply occupy land and call it theirs would create chaos. We're not anyone, Eleanor said, feeling anger burn through anxiety. We're a family that's lived on and improved that land for years. We've met every requirement that matters. The only thing we lack is completed paperwork that my father would have finished if he'd lived. But he didn't live, did he? And upon his death, the claim became unclear. You're asking this court to retroactively validate a claim that was never properly established, based on your occupation of land that legally belongs to the territory. That land belongs to my family, Eleanor said firmly. We've earned it through work and sacrifice. That should matter more than bureaucratic procedure. Should, Pemberton repeated, as if the word were distasteful. But the law doesn't work on should, Miss Wade. It works on is. And the fact is, your family's claim was never properly completed, and you lack the legal standing to retroactively complete it. Harrison stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Pemberton is arguing his case rather than asking questions. If he has specific questions for the witness, he should ask them. Sustained, Morrison said, his voice neutral. Mr. Pemberton, please confine yourself to questions. Pemberton shifted tactics, asking about specific improvements, about the details of their survival, clearly trying to find inconsistencies or admissions that would undermine their case. Eleanor answered as carefully as she could, aware that every word mattered, that she was walking through a minefield of legal traps. She saw Cole watching intently from his seat, saw her siblings holding each other in the gallery, and drew strength from their presence. When Pemberton finally finished and she was allowed to step down, Eleanor felt exhausted, wrung out from the effort of defending herself and her family in a system designed to favor people like Barrett Merrick. She resumed her seat beside Cole, and his hand found hers immediately, warm and solid and grounding. Harrison called a few more witnesses in the afternoon. Thomas testified briefly about maintaining the property, about the work they'd all done. A neighboring homesteader spoke passionately about the Wade family's right to their land, about the broader implications if the court ruled against them. Each testimony added another layer to their case, another voice arguing that justice demanded recognizing what they'd built regardless of paperwork technicalities. Then Barrett Merrick himself took the stand. Cole went rigid beside Eleanor as his father was sworn in, tension radiating from every line of his body. Pemberton's questions were designed to make Merrick seem reasonable, concerned only with proper procedure and legal clarity rather than land acquisition. Mr. Merrick, why did you file this challenge? Because unclear land claims create problems for everyone, Merrick said smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. I have significant holdings in this area. When I plan grazing rotations or water access or expansion, I need to know which land is legitimately claimed and which is available. The Wade property sits in a strategically important corridor. I need clarity about its status. And if the claim is ruled invalid, do you intend to claim that land yourself? If it's legally available, yes. I would file proper claims and incorporate it into my ranch operations. That's good business and good land management. Have you ever offered to help the Wade family complete their filing? The question was clearly rehearsed, designed to make Merrick seem generous. I offered to purchase the property for a fair price, more than fair actually, $500 for land and improvements. That would have given them resources to establish themselves elsewhere, perhaps somewhere more suitable for a young woman trying to raise siblings alone. Eleanor felt rage burn through her at the condescension in his voice, the implication that she was incapable, that their home was somehow unsuitable because it was humble. Harrison must have felt her tension because he squeezed her arm warningly, reminding her silently to maintain composure. When Harrison rose for cross-examination, there was steel in his voice that Eleanor hadn't heard before. Mr. Merrick, you testified that you need clarity about land status for ranch planning. But isn't it true that you knew the Wade family was occupying that property when you filed this challenge? I knew someone was living there, yes. And you knew they'd been living there for years? That they'd built a cabin, established a garden, integrated into the community? I knew there was a structure. I didn't investigate the details of their occupation. You didn't investigate? Harrison's voice dripped skepticism. You're asking this court to believe that before filing a legal challenge that could destroy a family's home, you didn't bother to investigate whether their occupation was legitimate? I investigated the legal status of their claim. That's what matters. Does it? More than the human reality of what you'd be doing? Harrison moved closer to the witness stand, his intensity increasing. Mr. Merrick, how much land does your ranch currently encompass? Approximately 40,000 acres. 40,000 acres. And the Wade property is approximately 160 acres? Approximately. So you're seeking to add 160 acres, less than 0.5% of your current holdings, by displacing a family of 4 who have nowhere else to go. Does that seem proportionate to you? Pemberton stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. The size of Mr. Merrick's holdings is irrelevant to the legal question of whether the Wade claim is valid. Harrison wheeled on the judge before Morrison could rule. It's entirely relevant, Your Honor. This case is supposedly about legal procedure and proper claims, but the reality is it's about a wealthy rancher using legal technicalities to take land from a struggling family because he can. Mr. Merrick's extensive holdings demonstrate that this isn't about need, it's about power and accumulation. Morrison considered for a long moment, and Eleanor held her breath waiting for his ruling. Finally, I'll allow the question. Mr. Merrick, please answer. Merrick's face had gone cold, his composure cracking slightly. The size of my ranch is irrelevant. What matters is following proper legal procedure. Convenient that proper legal procedure happens to work in favor of the wealthy and connected, isn't it? Harrison didn't wait for an answer, pressing forward. Mr. Merrick, isn't it true that you've acquired several properties in recent years through similar legal challenges? Properties occupied by homesteaders whose claims had paperwork irregularities? I've participated in territorial land proceedings when necessary to clarify ownership. Yes, participated in proceedings, Harrison repeated. That's one way of describing systematically targeting vulnerable homesteaders. How many families have lost their homes because of these proceedings, Mr. Merrick? Objection. Pemberton was on his feet, face flushed. This is harassment of the witness, not legitimate questioning. Sustained, Morrison said, but Eleanor saw something in his expression that might have been discomfort. Mr. Harrison, move on. Harrison returned to the defense table, but he'd made his point. The gallery was murmuring, and Eleanor saw several faces that had been neutral now watching Barrett Merrick with open hostility. Harrison had successfully reframed the case from dry legal procedure to something more primal, wealthy power trying to crush working-class survival. The afternoon stretched longer as final arguments were made, as Harrison and Pemberton battled over interpretations of law and precedent, as the case was reduced to competing narratives about what justice demanded. Eleanor listened with exhaustion replacing anxiety, too drained to maintain the heightened tension that had carried her through the day. Whatever happened now was beyond her control. She'd testified, had told their truth, had presented herself and her family as honestly as possible. The rest was up to Morrison. Judge Morrison finally called an end to testimony as the winter sun slanted low through the courtroom windows. I'll take this matter under advisement, he announced, his voice giving nothing away. Both parties will be notified of my decision within 3 days. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell with terrible finality, and suddenly it was over. No immediate verdict, no dramatic revelation, just Morrison disappearing into his chambers and the courtroom beginning to empty. Eleanor sat frozen, not quite able to process that months of anxiety had culminated in this anticlimactic ending. 3 more days of waiting, 3 more days of not knowing whether they'd lost everything. Cole pulled her gently to her feet, and she realized her siblings were there, pressing close, all of them looking to her for reassurance she didn't have to give. Harrison was gathering papers with mechanical efficiency, his expression revealing nothing about how he thought it had gone. "Did we win?" Samuel asked, his 7-year-old voice cutting through adult circumspection to the question that mattered. "We don't know yet, buddy," Cole said gently, lifting the boy into his arms. "The judge needs time to think about everything he heard today. But we made our case. We showed him the truth. Now we wait and see if truth matters more than power." They filed out of the courtroom into cold evening air, and Eleanor saw Barrett Merrick standing on the courthouse steps with his lawyer, the 2 men deep in conversation. Merrick's eyes found Cole, and father and son stared at each other across the space that separated them. A distance measured in more than feet, measured in principles and choices, and the unbridgeable gap between 2 visions of what life should be. Barrett Merrick spoke first, his voice carrying clearly. "Son, you've made your position clear. When this is done, when the judge rules in my favor as he will, I want you to understand something. You've burned every bridge. You've chosen poverty and strangers over family and legacy. Don't come asking for forgiveness or reinstatement." Cole's response was quiet but firm, pitched to carry to his father but not broadcast to the gathered crowd. "I chose integrity over complicity. If that costs me your approval and my inheritance, then the price is worth paying. I'm not coming back, Father. Not to your ranch, not to your empire, not to the life you've mapped out. I'm building something different, something that doesn't require destroying other people to maintain." "Noble words from someone who's never had to actually struggle," Merrick said coldly. "Let's see how noble you feel when reality sets in and you realize you've thrown away security for people who'll never be able to give you the life you're accustomed to." "The life I'm accustomed to is empty," Cole replied. "I'd rather struggle with people I respect than prosper through exploitation. Mother understood that. I wish you still could." He turned away before his father could respond, guiding Eleanor and her siblings toward the wagon. But Eleanor looked back and saw Barrett Merrick's expression, and beneath the anger and coldness, she glimpsed something that might have been pain, the complicated grief of a father losing a son not to death but to differing principles. They returned to the boarding house in heavy silence, exhaustion settling over all of them like a blanket. Mrs. Chen had supper waiting, her kindness continuing to surprise Eleanor, and they ate mechanically, too drained for conversation. Harrison joined them briefly to say he thought the case had gone as well as could be expected given the circumstances, but his careful optimism did little to ease Eleanor's anxiety. That night, lying in the small room with her sleeping siblings around her, Eleanor tried to imagine what came next. If Morrison ruled for them, they'd return home victorious, the land secured absolutely, able to finally relax the constant vigilance that had defined their existence. If he ruled against them, they'd have to pack up everything they owned, leave the cabin her father built, surrender the land they'd fought so desperately to keep. Even if Cole's promise to start over somewhere else was genuine, the thought of leaving felt like dying, like losing not just a place, but an essential part of herself. 3 days, 72 hours between now and knowing. Eleanor didn't think she'd survive the wait, but of course she would because she had to, because her siblings were depending on her strength, even when she had none left. She'd survived her parents' deaths and months of desperate poverty and the fear of losing everything to Barrett Merrick's legal maneuvering. She could survive 3 more days. She had to. The 3 days of waiting stretched like years, each hour dragging with the weight of uncertainty. Eleanor tried to keep busy, tried to maintain normalcy for her siblings, but everything felt suspended, caught between possible futures. They stayed at the boarding house, unable to return home until they knew whether home would still be theirs, and the small rooms became a kind of limbo, neither here nor there, neither safe nor lost, just waiting. On the 2nd day, Harrison came with news that made Eleanor's stomach drop. "I've heard rumors," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. Judge Morrison has been seen meeting privately with Barrett Merrick's lawyers. It could be innocent, procedural questions, clarifications, but it could also mean they're negotiating the terms of a ruling in Merrick's favor. Can he do that? Cole demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. Can he just decide our case based on private meetings? Technically, no. Practically? Harrison shrugged, his expression grim. Judges have enormous discretion in these cases. If Morrison wants to rule for Merrick, he'll find legal justification for it. The question is whether he wants to badly enough to ignore the obvious injustice. Eleanor felt something harden in her chest, anger replacing the anxiety that had been consuming her. She'd known the system was weighted against people like her, had understood intellectually that wealth bought influence, but experiencing it directly, watching the process designed to protect homesteaders be twisted to serve the exact opposite purpose, it ignited something fierce inside her. Then we make sure everyone knows, she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning through her. If Morrison rules against us, we make sure the whole territory understands it was politics and money, not justice. We make him pay the price of public opinion, even if we can't win in his courtroom. Cole looked at her with something like pride. What are you thinking? I'm thinking there are newspapers here, reporters who'd be interested in the story of a wealthy rancher using legal manipulation to steal land from orphaned children. I'm thinking public pressure might be the only leverage we have left. Eleanor's mind was racing now, strategy forming from desperation. Harrison, can you arrange for me to speak with journalists? Today, before the ruling comes? Harrison's thin smile held approval. I can do better than that. There's a reporter from the Territorial Gazette who's been following the case. Woman named Sarah Mitchell. She's got a reputation for exposing exactly this kind of corruption. Let me reach out to her. Within hours, Sarah Mitchell was sitting in Mrs. Chen's parlor, a sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 40 with ink-stained fingers and the air of someone who'd spent years extracting truth from reluctant sources. She listened as Eleanor told their story, not the sanitized legal version from the courtroom, but the raw human reality of it. The influenza that took their parents, the months of desperate survival, Cole's unexpected kindness, Barrett Merrick's systematic campaign to take their land. Eleanor held nothing back, letting her anger and fear and fierce determination show through. This isn't just about my family, Eleanor said, leaning forward with intensity. This is about whether Montana Territory is going to be a place where working people can build homes, or whether it's going to be carved up by wealthy men who see land as nothing but property to accumulate. Every homesteader in this territory is watching this case. They're wondering if what happened to us could happen to them. They're wondering if the law protects them or just protects the powerful. Sarah's pencil moved rapidly across her notebook, capturing every word. And Cole Merrick, the son standing against his own father. That's quite a story. It's not a story, Cole said quietly. It's a choice everyone has to make at some point, whether to uphold injustice because it benefits you or stand against it even when it costs you everything. I chose to stand. My father chose differently. Sarah asked pointed questions for over an hour, digging into details, confirming facts, building the narrative that would appear in the next day's Territorial Gazette. When she finally left, her expression suggested she'd found exactly the kind of story she'd been hoping for, one with clear villains and heroes, with injustice that would outrage readers, with stakes that mattered beyond the immediate parties involved. That woman is going to light a fire under Morrison, Harrison observed with satisfaction after Sarah departed. The judge won't want to be portrayed as the corrupt official who ruled against orphaned children on behalf of a wealthy rancher. Public opinion matters, even to territorial judges. Unless he's already made his decision and doesn't care about public opinion, Thomas said, his 12-year-old pragmatism cutting through adult optimism. Then at least people will know the truth, Eleanor replied. At least we won't lose in silence and obscurity. At least we'll have fought with everything we had. The third day arrived with painful slowness. Sarah Mitchell's article appeared in the Morning Gazette, and it was everything Eleanor had hoped for, passionate, detailed, painting Barrett Merrick as exactly the kind of land-grabbing baron that territorial reformers had been warning about. The article didn't just cover their case, It exposed Merrick's pattern of similar challenges, named other families he'd displaced, questioned whether territorial land law was serving its intended purpose or just enabling wealthy consolidation. By mid-morning, the boarding house had received 3 visits from other homesteaders, people Eleanor had never met who'd read the article and wanted to offer support. By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, homesteaders and their families holding signs demanding fair treatment and just rulings. The case that had seemed like a private struggle had become something larger, a flashpoint for tensions that had been building throughout the territory. Morrison has to have seen this, Cole said, watching the growing crowd from the boarding house window. He has to know that whatever he decides will make him either a hero or a villain to half the territory. Which half has more power? Margaret asked, showing the uncomfortable insight that poverty had taught her. The ranchers have money, Cole acknowledged, but the homesteaders have numbers and vote. Morrison's appointed now, but territorial judges eventually have to face election if they want to stay in office. Public opinion might matter more than he'd like to admit. The summons came at 3 o'clock. A messenger from the courthouse, informing them that Judge Morrison was ready to deliver his ruling. Eleanor's hands shook as she helped her siblings into their coats, as she prepared to walk back into that courtroom one final time. This was it. The moment that would determine whether they returned home victorious or left Montana Territory defeated. The crowd outside the courthouse had grown even larger, and they parted to let Eleanor and her family through, their faces showing support and hope, and the desperate desire to see justice prevail. Eleanor felt the weight of their expectation, the knowledge that she was representing more than just her own family now. She was representing every homesteader who'd ever been pushed aside by wealthy power, every working family trying to build something against overwhelming odds. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing against the walls, filling the gallery completely. Barrett Merrick sat in his usual spot with Pemberton, but Eleanor noticed his expression was less confident than before, his jaw tight with tension that suggested he'd seen the article and understood its implications. Across the aisle, Cole sat beside her, his presence steady and grounding, his choice to stand with her made visible to everyone present. Judge Morrison entered with his usual gravity, but Eleanor thought she detected something different in his bearing. Uncertainty, maybe? Or the weight of knowing his decision would be scrutinized by more people than usual. He settled into his seat, arranged papers before him, and let the tension build for a long moment before speaking. I've reviewed the evidence presented, the testimony offered, and the relevant territorial statutes governing homestead claims, Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. This case presents a conflict between procedural requirements and the essential purposes of homestead law. On one side, we have incomplete paperwork and technical deficiencies. On the other, we have a family that has clearly met the core requirements of homesteading, continuous occupation, good faith improvements, and the establishment of a genuine home. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she felt dizzy. She couldn't read Morrison's expression, couldn't tell from his words which way he was leaning. Beside her, Cole's hand found hers, squeezing gently, offering what comfort he could. Mr. Merrick's attorneys argue that paperwork requirements exist for good reason and cannot be waived simply because a family faces hardship, Morrison continued. They're not wrong about the importance of proper documentation. Our territorial land system depends on clear, complete records. However, he paused, and Eleanor saw his gaze move across the packed courtroom, taking in the faces watching him. The purpose of homestead law is not to create bureaucratic obstacles. It exists to give working families the opportunity to establish homes through their own labor and commitment. Morrison shifted his attention directly to Eleanor, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Miss Wade, you and your siblings have demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of devastating loss. You've maintained and improved property that your father began claiming. You've integrated into your community. You've built a home in the truest sense of that word. The technical deficiencies in your filing are real, but they are also the result of circumstances beyond your control. Your father's untimely death and your own focus on survival rather than bureaucratic procedure. Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't move, caught between hope and terror, as Morrison's words seemed to point in one direction but hadn't yet reached a conclusion. After careful consideration of the law and the facts, I find that the Wade family's claim, while imperfect in its documentation, meets the essential requirements of homestead law. The continuous occupation, the visible improvements, the good faith establishment of a home, these core elements are present and undeniable. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Miss Eleanor Wade. The challenge filed by Barrett Merrick is denied. The Wade homestead claim is hereby validated and confirmed. The words hit Eleanor like a physical force, relief so overwhelming it nearly drove her to her knees. Around her, the courtroom erupted in cheers from the homesteaders who'd packed the gallery, while Barrett Merrick's face went dark with rage. Morrison raised his hand for silence, clearly not finished. Furthermore, the judge continued once quiet had been restored, I am ordering that Miss Wade be given 60 days to complete any remaining filing requirements, with all fees waived given the family's financial circumstances and the extraordinary hardships they've faced. The Territorial Land Office will provide assistance in completing proper documentation. At the end of that 60-day period, the Wade claim will be recognized as complete and valid in all respects. Harrison was on his feet, speaking formal words of gratitude to the court, but Eleanor barely heard him. She was crying, great shuddering sobs of relief that she couldn't control and didn't try to. Her siblings pressed against her, all of them crying too. The tension of months finally breaking into tears that mixed grief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. They'd won. Against all odds, against Barrett Merrick's wealth and power and legal manipulation, they'd won. Cole pulled them all into an embrace, his own eyes wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "You did it," he whispered against Eleanor's hair. "You fought and you won. Your land is yours, Eleanor. Your home is secure." Morrison brought his gavel down one final time. This court is adjourned. As people filed out of the courtroom, homesteaders stopping to congratulate Eleanor and shake her hand, she caught sight of Barrett Merrick. He was standing alone. Even Pemberton had stepped away, and his face carried an expression she hadn't expected. Not just anger, but something that looked almost like grief. His eyes found Cole, and for a moment father and son stared at each other across the courtroom that had witnessed their final break. Then Merrick turned and left without a word, his straight back and rigid shoulders the only indication of the emotions he refused to show. Cole watched him go with an expression of complicated sorrow, and Eleanor understood that victory, however necessary, had come at a cost for the man she loved. Outside the courthouse, the crowd celebrated as if the Wade victory were their own victory, which, in a sense, it was. Sarah Mitchell appeared with her notebook, asking for reactions, already composing the follow-up article that would spread news of this ruling throughout the territory. Other homesteaders shared their own stories of challenges from wealthy ranchers, emboldened now by the precedent Morrison had set. The Wade case had become more than just one family's struggle. It had become a symbol of resistance against consolidation and power, but eventually the crowd dispersed, reality reasserting itself over the euphoria of victory. Eleanor and her family returned to the boarding house one final time to pack their few belongings and prepare for the journey home. Home. The word felt different now, no longer tentative or threatened, but solid and sure. They were going home to land that was legally, absolutely, unquestionably theirs. Mrs. Chen prepared a celebratory supper for them, refusing payment and declaring that feeding people who'd struck a blow against territorial corruption was payment enough. They ate together, Eleanor and her siblings, Cole and Harrison, Mrs. Chen, and even Sarah Mitchell, who'd been invited to join them. The conversation flowed easily now that the weight of uncertainty had lifted, stories and laughter replacing the grim tension that had defined the past days. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked Eleanor as they finished the meal. "Now that your land is secure, what comes next?" Eleanor looked around the table at her siblings, at Cole watching her with open affection, at the people who'd helped them win this impossible fight. "We go home," she said simply. "We finish the spring planting. We continue building the life we started. And we help other homesteaders when they face challenges like ours, share what we learned, offer what support we can. This victory shouldn't be rare or remarkable. It should be normal for families to keep the homes they've built." "And you, Mr. Merrick?" Sarah turned her attention to Cole. "You've sacrificed your inheritance and your father's approval to stand with this family. Any regrets?" Cole's answer came without hesitation. "None. My father built an empire, but he lost himself in the process. I'd rather build something smaller and keep my soul intact." He looked at Eleanor, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Besides, I've gained far more than I've lost." Later, after supper had ended and Harrison and Sarah had departed, after Mrs. Chen had shooed them all toward bed with maternal insistence, Cole asked Eleanor to step outside for a moment. The night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, the territorial capital settling into nighttime quiet around them. "Eleanor," Cole began, then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Before the hearing, I said I had a question I wanted to ask once your land was secure. Do you remember?" "I remember," Eleanor said softly, her heart beginning to race with anticipation and hope and barely controlled joy. Cole took her hands in his grip warm despite the cold. "These past months with you and your siblings, they've shown me what family actually means. Not bloodlines or inheritances or empires to maintain, but people choosing each other, supporting each other, building something real together. You've given me more purpose and joy than I ever had at my father's ranch. You've shown me who I want to be." He paused, and Eleanor saw nervousness in his expression, as if he could possibly doubt what her answer would be. "I love you, Eleanor Wade. I love your strength and your courage and the way you fight for what matters. I love Thomas and Margaret and Samuel like they were already my siblings. I love the home you've built from nothing, the life you've created against impossible odds." Cole's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I want to be part of that life, not as a helper or friend, but as family. Will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband and let me help you raise these incredible children and let us build a future together on that land you fought so hard to keep?" Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears, pure joy, uncomplicated by fear or grief or uncertainty. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Cole. I love you, and I want nothing more than to build a life with you. You've already become family to us. This just makes it official." Cole pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promise and hope and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor was laughing through her tears, giddy with happiness that felt almost impossible after months of struggle and fear. "All four of us," Cole said softly, echoing words from their first meeting. "That's how it started. Me saying I'd make sure all four of you could stay. That's how it'll always be. All five of us now, I suppose. A family by choice rather than blood, but no less real for that." "More real," Eleanor corrected, "because we chose this. Because we fought for it. Because we all know exactly how much it costs and how much it's worth." They stood together in the cold Montana night, holding each other, and Eleanor felt pieces of her life clicking into place. The security of land that was indisputably theirs, the man she loved choosing her freely and completely, her siblings safe and thriving, the future opening up with possibilities she'd barely dared to imagine. The journey from that first desperate day when Cole had ridden up to their struggling cabin to this moment of absolute triumph had been harder than anything she could have anticipated. But standing here now, feeling Cole's arms around her and knowing that home was waiting for them, Eleanor understood that every hardship had been necessary, every struggle had built toward this perfect moment of arrival. The next morning, they began the journey home. The wagon that had carried them to the territorial capital in fear now carried them back in triumph. The legal documents Harrison had secured tucked safely in Eleanor's bag, proof absolute that the land was theirs, that no one could ever challenge them again. The winter landscape looked different somehow, less harsh and more beautiful, as if victory had transformed even the Montana terrain itself. They reached the cabin as the sun set on the second day of travel, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion at the sight of it. The structure that had seemed so fragile and threatened now stood solid and permanent, no longer just shelter, but truly home. Cole had improved it so much over the winter months. The roof was sound, the walls were tight, the barn was sturdy. It looked like a place where a family could thrive, not just survive. Thomas and Margaret ran ahead, eager to check on their cow and the chickens they'd left with a neighbor, their voices bright with joy at being back. Samuel clung to Eleanor's hand, his small face beaming with the relief of return. This was familiar. This was theirs. This was home. Cole helped Eleanor down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist, his expression carrying the same wonder she felt. "This is really happening," he said quietly. "This is really our future." "Our future," Eleanor repeated, loving the sound of it. "Together." They spent the evening settling back in, lighting fires against the cold, checking that everything had survived their absence. The cabin that had seemed small when it housed 4 now felt cozy rather than cramped with 5, space made sufficient by love and shared purpose. They made supper together, falling into easy domestic rhythms that suggested how well they'd work as a partnership. Margaret told stories that made everyone laugh. Thomas demonstrated his improving skills at various tasks. Samuel chattered about everything and nothing with the unselfconscious joy of a child who felt absolutely secure. Later, after the children were in bed, Eleanor and Cole sat together by the fire, planning the future that now felt genuinely possible. They'd marry in the spring, Cole said, when the weather improved and they could invite the neighbors and homesteaders who'd supported them. They'd expand the cabin slightly to accommodate 5 people more comfortably. They'd increase the garden, maybe acquire another cow, build slowly and carefully toward prosperity rather than just survival. "What about your father?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Will he ever forgive you for choosing us over his empire?" Cole was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't know. Part of me hopes he will, hopes that losing me might make him reconsider what actually matters. But I can't control that, and I can't let his approval determine my choices. I made my decision, and I'd make it again without hesitation." He turned to look at her directly. "I don't regret losing an inheritance. I regret that my father became someone who valued empire over integrity. But that's his burden to carry, not mine." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I wish your mother could see you now, see the man you've become. I think she'd be proud." "I think she'd be glad I finally understood what she was trying to teach me," Cole agreed. "That character isn't inherited, it's chosen. That family isn't about blood, it's about commitment. That building something worth having sometimes means walking away from what you're offered." His arm tightened around Eleanor. "She would have loved you, I think, recognized in you the same fierce determination she had. You're more alike than you know, both of you willing to fight for what matters, regardless of the cost." They sat together in companionable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, and Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known since before her parents died. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had finally released its grip. They were safe. They were home. They were together. Everything else, the work of farming, the challenges of expanding their homestead, the daily struggles of frontier life, would come, but she'd face it all with Cole beside her and her siblings thriving around them. Spring arrived gradually, winter reluctant to fully release its grip on Montana territory. But eventually warmth returned. Snow melted to reveal muddy earth ready for planting, and the world turned green with new growth. Eleanor and Cole were married on a brilliant April morning, standing before the cabin with half the homesteaders in the territory gathered to witness. They had no expensive ceremony, no elaborate preparations, just 2 people making promises to each other while surrounded by family and community. Thomas stood beside Cole as his best man, solemn with the responsibility and pride. Margaret was Eleanor's attendant, practically glowing with satisfaction at seeing her predictions come true. Samuel scattered wildflower petals with enthusiastic abandon. Harrison attended as honored guest, having become a friend as much as their lawyer. Even Sarah Mitchell came, documenting the event for the Territorial Gazette with an article that framed it as the perfect ending to the story she'd been following. The promises Eleanor and Cole made to each other were simple but profound. To stand together through hardship and joy. To build a home worth having, to raise their children, biological or chosen, with love and integrity. To remember always that some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth choosing deliberately even when easier paths beckoned. They exchanged simple bands that Cole had commissioned from a traveling metalsmith, metal hammered smooth and inscribed with their initials and the date. When the circuit minister pronounced them married, the gathered homesteaders erupted in cheers. Mrs. Henderson from the trading post produced a fiddle and began playing, and soon the front yard was filled with dancing and laughter and celebration. Food appeared as neighbors shared what they had: precious sugar cookies, smoked meat, preserved fruits carefully rationed from winter stores. It was a community celebration as much as a personal one, these families who'd supported the Wades throughout their struggle now rejoicing in their triumph. Eleanor danced with Cole, with Thomas, with Samuel, with neighbors she barely knew but who'd stood with them when it mattered. She watched her siblings laughing and playing with other children, looking healthier and happier than they had in months. She saw the life they'd fought so hard to build finally taking shape, becoming real, solid, permanent. As evening approached and guests began departing for their own homesteads, Barrett Merrick appeared on horseback at the edge of the property. Eleanor saw him first, felt her body tense instinctively, but Cole's hand on her arm steadied her. Together they watched as Barrett dismounted slowly, hat in his hands, approaching with visible reluctance. The conversation between father and son happened away from the lingering guests, private words for a complicated relationship. Eleanor couldn't hear what was said, but she watched the body language, Barrett's rigid posture gradually relaxing, Cole's defensive stance softening slightly. When they finally embraced, briefly and awkwardly, Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't full reconciliation, might never be that, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that blood ties survived even profound disagreement. Barrett approached Eleanor afterward, his weathered face showing discomfort but also determination. "Mrs. Merrick," he said, the title formal and pointed. "I came to offer my belated congratulations on your marriage and to apologize for the distress my actions caused your family." The words were stiff, clearly difficult for him, but Eleanor heard genuine regret beneath the formality. "Thank you, Mr. Merrick. I appreciate that. My son tells me I was wrong to challenge your claim, that I let grief and ambition twist my values into something my late wife wouldn't recognize." Barrett's voice roughened slightly at the mention of his wife. "He's not wrong. I've been lost since she died. Built an empire, but lost sight of why I was building it. The land is yours absolutely, Mrs. Merrick. You have my word. No more challenges, no interference. You've earned this home." "We all have," Eleanor said gently. "Your son, most of all. He gave up everything to stand for what was right. That takes a special kind of courage." Barrett's eyes moved to where Cole was helping Thomas with something, the easy affection between them visible even at a distance. "I know. I'm proud of him, though I've done a poor job showing it. He's become the man his mother hoped he'd be. Better than I managed." He settled his hat back on his head, preparing to leave. "The land you have, it's good land, but it's just a start. If you ever want to expand, there's a section adjoining yours to the east that I'll deed to you as a wedding gift. Not charity," he added quickly, seeing Eleanor's expression. A father helping his son and new daughter-in-law establish themselves. "If you'll accept it." Eleanor looked at Cole, who'd rejoined them in time to hear his father's offer. Husband and wife exchanged a glance, a whole conversation happening in that look before Cole spoke. "We'll accept, Father, with gratitude. Not because we need it to survive, but because it represents something important. You recognizing that building a home matters more than building an empire. Mother would be pleased by that recognition." Barrett nodded shortly, emotion flickering across his face before he controlled it. "She would. She'd be pleased by a lot of things about this day." He mounted his horse with the ease of long practice. "You're welcome at the ranch, son. Both of you, all of you. When you're ready, the door's open." He rode off without waiting for a response, his straight back and steady pace suggesting a man carrying his burdens with as much dignity as he could muster. Cole watched him go with an expression of complicated relief, grief, and hope mingling in equal measure. "He's trying," Eleanor said softly. "That's more than I expected." "It's more than he's done in years," Cole agreed. "Maybe losing me, almost losing me permanently, reminded him what actually matters. Or maybe he's just tired of being alone in that big house, surrounded by wealth but empty of the things that make life worth living." He turned to Eleanor, pulling her close. "Either way, we'll give him time. Let him prove through actions that he means what he said. Family isn't automatic. It's earned through choices and commitment." The last of the guests departed as night fell, leaving just the five of them, Eleanor and Cole, Thomas and Margaret and Samuel. They gathered in the cabin that now legally belonged to all of them, lit lamps against the darkness, and shared a final meal of their wedding day. The children were exhausted from excitement, barely able to keep their eyes open. Cole carried Samuel to bed, then came back to help Eleanor clean up the remains of the celebration. "This is really our life now," Eleanor said, marveling at the transformation from that first desperate winter. "Married, secure, building something real. Sometimes I have to remind myself it's not a dream I'll wake up from." "If it's a dream, we're both having it," Cole replied, his arms coming around her from behind as she worked at the wash basin. "And I never want to wake up. This, you, the children, this home we're building, it's everything I ever wanted without knowing I wanted it." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd ridden into their lives 7 months ago and changed everything. "All 4 of you, get in," she quoted softly, remembering those first words. "That's what you said that first day. You were here to make sure we could stay." "And here we are," Cole said, his voice warm with satisfaction. "All 5 of us now, staying, thriving, building something that'll last." He kissed her gently, a promise and a celebration in one gesture. "Your father started this legacy when he claimed this land. Your mother built on it. You fought for it and kept it alive. Now we get to continue it together, not just surviving, but genuinely living, creating the kind of home worth passing down to future generations." Future generations. The phrase carried weight and promise, the suggestion of children who'd grow up secure and loved, who'd inherit not just land but the values that had preserved it. Eleanor let herself imagine that future, Cole's children and hers, siblings to Thomas and Margaret and Samuel, a family growing and thriving on this Montana homestead. It seemed impossible that just months ago she'd been terrified of losing everything. And now she stood here married to a man she loved, surrounded by family, facing a future bright with possibility. Margaret appeared in the bedroom doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Eleanor, are you happy?" Eleanor crossed to her sister, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Yes, honey, I'm very happy. Are you?" "Yes. I like having Cole as part of our family. I like that we don't have to be scared anymore. I like that Thomas smiles more now, and Samuel laughs all the time, and you don't look so tired and worried." Margaret yawned hugely. "I like that we're home, and it's really, truly ours forever." "Forever," Eleanor confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "This is ours, and no one can ever take it from us. You're safe here, Margaret. We all are." She tucked her sister back into bed, then stood in the doorway watching all 3 children sleep. Thomas sprawled across more than his share of the bed, Margaret curled into a neat ball, Samuel clutching the carved wooden horse Cole had given him months ago. They looked peaceful, secure in ways they hadn't since before their parents died. Whatever struggles lay ahead, whatever challenges Montana Territory would throw at them, these children would face them from a foundation of safety and love. Cole appeared beside her, his arms settling around her waist as they watched the sleeping children together. "They're good kids. We're lucky to have them." "We're lucky to have each other," Eleanor corrected. "All of us. This family we've built from loss and struggle and stubborn hope. That's the real victory. Not just keeping the land, but creating something worth keeping it for." They returned to the main room, banked the fire for the night, prepared for sleep in the cabin that now held a married couple and their children. As Eleanor lay in Cole's arms in the bed they'd share from this night forward, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The grief and fear and desperate survival, yes, but also the unexpected kindness, the growing love, the discovery that sometimes family found you when you needed it most. Months turned to seasons, seasons to years. The homestead flourished under Eleanor and Cole's combined labor, expanding gradually as they incorporated the additional land Barrett had deeded to them. Thomas grew into a young man of character and competence, eventually claiming his own section of land adjacent to theirs. Margaret's fierce spirit and sharp mind served her well. She became a teacher, educating homesteader children throughout the territory. Samuel grew up secure and happy, never doubting his place in the world or his family's love. Barrett Merrick never fully recaptured the warmth he'd possessed before his wife's death, but he built a careful relationship with his son and daughter-in-law, with the grandchildren who eventually came. He learned slowly to value people over property, to see his workers as individuals rather than resources. The change was incomplete and imperfect, but it was real. When he died 15 years after Cole's wedding, he left his ranch not to empire builders, but to the men who'd worked it faithfully, dividing his holdings among longtime employees with the same care he'd once used only for accumulation. The Wade Merrick homestead became known throughout Montana Territory as an example of what was possible when courage met opportunity, when integrity refused to bend to power. Eleanor and Cole's story spread beyond their immediate community, inspiring other homesteaders to stand firm against challenges, giving hope to families struggling to establish themselves. Sarah Mitchell's articles about the case were republished repeatedly, referenced in territorial debates about land law reform, cited as evidence that the system could work for ordinary people when those people refused to surrender. But for Eleanor, the larger meaning was always secondary to the immediate reality of the life they'd built. She measured success not in acres or influence, but in family meals shared around the table her father had built, in children growing up confident and kind, in the way Cole still looked at her after years of marriage, as if she were the most important person in his world. The homestead thrived because they worked hard and supported each other, because they remembered always that land without love was just dirt, and buildings without family were just shelter. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Cole took Eleanor to the spot where they'd stood on their wedding night, looking out at the land that had nearly been taken from them. The cabin had been expanded twice now, transformed from desperate shelter into a proper home. The barn was large and sound, the garden abundant, the cattle herd growing steadily. Everything spoke of prosperity earned through labor and love. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Eleanor asked, leaning against her husband's familiar strength. "When Samuel asked if you were here to make us leave?" "I said I was here to make sure you stayed," Cole recalled, his voice warm with memory. "And I meant it. Though I had no idea then how literally that would come to be true, how completely your family would become my family." "All four of you, get in," Eleanor quoted with a smile. "That's how it started. Your basic decency, your willingness to help without expecting anything in return. That changed everything." "You changed everything," Cole corrected. "Your courage, your refusal to surrender, your determination to keep your family together against impossible odds. That's what I saw that first day, a woman building something real from almost nothing. That's what I fell in love with. That's what I wanted to be part of." Eleanor turned to face him, this man who'd given up everything to stand with her family, who'd built a life with them that honored both struggle and triumph. "We built this together, all five of us, and someday our children will tell the story to their children, how we fought for this place, how we refused to let power take what love had created, how we proved that family isn't just blood, but choice and commitment." The Montana sky stretched enormous above them, stars beginning to emerge as twilight deepened. From the cabin behind them came sounds of their children, 3 biological babies added to the original 3 siblings, a family of 8 now, loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Margaret was visiting with her husband, Thomas, with his new bride, Samuel, proudly showing off the horse he'd trained himself. The homestead that had nearly been lost now thrived with the next generation preparing to carry it forward. "All 4 of you, get in," Cole repeated softly, the phrase that had become their family motto, the reminder of where they'd started and what they'd survived. "Now it's all 8 of us, building something that'll last long after we're gone. Your parents would be proud, Eleanor, of what you protected, what you built, how you turned near disaster into this beautiful life." "Our life," Eleanor corrected, just as she'd corrected him so many times before. "Together. That's what made it possible. Not doing it alone, but finding each other and choosing to build something worth having." She smiled up at her husband, her partner, the man who'd ridden into her desperate existence and helped transform it into joy. "Thank you for that first ride. Thank you for seeing us as worth helping. Thank you for choosing us." "Thank you for letting me," Cole replied, "for trusting me despite everything my father did, for showing me what actually matters in life, for building this home that's become my home too." He kissed her gently, a gesture as familiar and comfortable as breathing after 10 years of marriage, for giving me the family I didn't know I was searching for. They stood together as darkness fell completely and the Montana stars blazed into brilliance above their homestead, this land they'd fought so hard to keep and had transformed into something magnificent through sheer stubborn love, Inside the cabin, family waited. The children they'd raised and protected, the grandchildren just beginning to arrive, the life they'd built from almost nothing. This was home. This was family. This was the victory that mattered. Not the legal triumph in Judge Morrison's courtroom, though that had been necessary, but the daily triumph of choosing each other, supporting each other, building something real in a territory that promised nothing but gave everything to those brave enough to fight for it. All 4 of them had gotten in, just as Cole had promised that first day. And then they'd become 5, then 8, a family that grew not just through births, but through the daily choice to stand together, to protect what mattered, to build a home worth fighting for. Under the vast Montana sky, Eleanor Wade Merrick held her husband's hand and felt the absolute certainty that this place, this family, this life they'd created together was exactly what her parents had dreamed of when they'd first claimed this land. They'd planted seeds, and those seeds had grown into something more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The rancher who'd said, "All 4 of you get in," had kept his promise. They'd stayed, they'd thrived, they'd won. And that victory, hard-earned and absolutely real, would echo through generations, a story of courage and love and the stubborn refusal to surrender what mattered, told and retold as long as the Montana wind blew across their homestead and family gathered around the table where it had all begun. Home, family, forever, family. The end.